Chapter 868. Why do I feel a sense of heartache and familiarity? Phyllis sniffed. She wasn't used to the princess' sharp tongue for the past few days, and she didn't think that she'd meet a little girl who was on par with her here. She looked into the little girl's bright and pure blue eyes, and she couldn't bring herself to dislike her in the slightest. Just like the princess, she couldn't bring herself to be angry at the sight of her face, as she was simply too beautiful. Furthermore, they were all so calm and collected when they spoke, as if they were talking about something that was only a matter of course. They weren't being sarcastic, so it was even more difficult to get angry at them. She really does look like the princess. Even the way she speaks and looks are the same. The young mistress should be similar to her now. Phyllis thought to herself as she looked into Amy's eyes. She suddenly had a lot of expectations for this job. It would definitely be interesting to work with such an adorable little half-elf. Do we have a new partner? At this moment, Mia and Sally also arrived. Mia was the first to enter the restaurant with a curious look on her face. She looked at Phyllis with a wide smile and said, "What a beautiful elf. I'm Mia. Welcome to the team." "I'm Barbara. Welcome to the team." Barbara was also looking at Phyllis with a curious expression. She was around the same age as her, and a sense of familiarity welled up in her heart. Phyllis immediately became a little nervous at the sight of all of the women walking into the restaurant. However, she relaxed slightly at the sight of Mia's friendly smile, and she hurriedly replied, I'm Phyllis. Thank you." Phyllis. Sally, who was walking at the back of the group, suddenly stopped in her tracks. She looked at Phyllis with a bewildered expression. She was Princess Irina's personal maidservant. So what was she doing here? Phyllis also noticed Sally standing at the entrance, and she reflexively took a couple of steps back. "I'm Aisha. I'm responsible for collecting the dishes, paying the bill, and cleaning the restaurant. Welcome to the team." Sally walked into the restaurant, and the surprise on her face had already faded. She looked at Phyllis in a calm manner, as if she didn't know Phyllis at all. "Thank you." Phyllis lowered her eyes. She didn't know if Sally really didn't recognize her, or if she was just pretending, but she didn't expose the fact that she was using a fake name. Not long ago, High Priestess Helena suggested that Sally should become a candidate for the princess. Among the few candidates, Sally was the most powerful and was considered to be the #1 candidate. Now that Irina had been stripped of her position as the princess, the position of the elven princess was vacant. If nothing went wrong, Sally would most likely replace Irina as the new princess. However, why would Sally, who was said to be cultivating in the Brewster family's territory, appear in Chaos City? She even became a waiter in a restaurant. This was simply too unbelievable. Meg glanced at Sally and Phyllis. The two of them had clearly recognized each other, but he wasn't too nervous. Sally was now on Irina's side, so he didn't have to worry that she would do anything to Phyllis. After spending some time together, he had learned that Sally was a completely trustworthy companion. Although she didn't talk much, she was always at the forefront when they were in danger. Furthermore, Sally had run away from home and hid in Chaos City, so she didn't have many sources of information. Perhaps she still didn't know what had happened in the Wind Forest. Meg changed his clothes and bought some information. After a short period of peace in the Wind Forest, preparations for the selection of a new elven princess had already been underway. The elven queen was in seclusion, and Irina had been stripped of her position. It could be said that the elves were at their weakest in the past 100 years. They had to appoint a new elven princess and make her the new idol of all elves. Sally naturally became the most popular candidate. "You two talk for a while. I'll go make lunch for you." Meg put Amy down and walked to the kitchen. "Big Sister Phyllis, you're an elf, and so is Big Sister Sally. Do you know each other?" Amy asked curiously. "No." Sally shook her head. Phyllis glanced at Sally and also shook her head. "No." Amy was a little disappointed, but she quickly smiled and said, "All right, that's okay. Then we'll get to know each other." Boss is very strict when it comes to hiring. Phyllis must be very capable to be able to get in, right? Yabamiya looked at Phyllis curiously. Everyone was also looking at Phyllis curiously. Everyone in the restaurant had their own jobs, and they all had their own specialties. This was enough to prove that Meg didn't choose waitresses based on their looks, but rather their abilities. I just know how to cook a little. Phyllis was a little reserved. The three waiters all had exceptional looks and temperaments. Moreover, they spoke in a generous manner, making people feel close to them. This was an amazing ability. Wow. You know how to cook? That's amazing. We can't help boss at all. He always does a lot of things by himself. If you can help him, that would be great. Mia was pleasantly surprised. Meg listened to the chatter of the girls in the kitchen, and a smile appeared on his face. This kind of working atmosphere made him feel very comfortable. Under Mia's guidance, Phyllis gradually relaxed, and her chatterbox also slowly opened up. When the girls gathered together, they didn't have to worry about not having anything to talk about. Soon, Meg finished cooking lunch and brought it to the table. He made a plate of Yangzhou fried rice for Phyllis. She would like the taste of the water of life. The six of them sat around the table. Phyllis looked at the table full of delicious food and the alluring aroma floating in the air. Her face was full of amazement. There was a fish in the middle of the long plate. The fish was covered with red chili, but it didn't have a pungent, spicy smell. Instead, it had an enticing, spicy smell. Just looking at it made one want to swallow. The aroma of the chicken soup assailed her nostrils. She couldn't help but be immersed in it with just a sniff. There was a special fragrance in the chicken soup. She was no stranger to this fragrance. It was a kind of mushroom that could be found occasionally in the wind forest. After this mushroom was left on a tree and dried, it would emit an alluring aroma like a spice. She had used it to make soup before, and it was sweet and delicious. She didn't expect to be able to eat it today. Moreover, Meg used it to make soup with chicken. It was a strange combination, but what attracted her the most was the beautiful fried rice in front of her. The rice was wrapped in golden eggs, and colorful ingredients were placed on a plate. All of them were cut to the size of rice grains. She had been curious about how Meg planned to use the ingredients that were cut so small, but now, looking at the evenly mixed ingredients on the plate, her doubts were completely dispelled. She was only left with admiration. It was so beautiful. Phyllis glanced at the others who had already started eating. After a moment of hesitation, she picked up the spoon and scooped a spoonful of fried rice in her mouth. This taste. Phyllis's eyes lit up. The egg that wrapped the rice melted in her mouth almost immediately. The winter bamboo shoots and green beans that were cut to the size of rice grains were crispy and delicious. The rice wrapped in the egg was full of sweetness after being chewed. The soft and sticky ham was mixed into the rice, and there seemed to be the taste of shrimp. All kinds of flavors were included in this one bite. After one bite, she felt warm all over, and the fragrance of the rice still lingered in her mouth. Of course, the most important thing was the faint fragrance hidden in the rice. She was 100% sure that it was the fragrance of the water of life. Chapter 869. You're amazing, Phyllis. You're the first person that boss has agreed to let you participate in the cooking process. Mia looked at Phyllis with amazement in her eyes. She had worked in the kitchen for many years, but Mag had almost never asked her to help in the cooking process, even when it came to preparing ingredients. Phyllis smiled at Mia, and she was quite happy. Great chefs were usually a little arrogant and wouldn't let anyone into their kitchen. Big Sister Irina told me to keep an eye on the big sister near father. Amy looked at Phyllis with ugly duckling in her arms. Then, her gaze gradually moved down, and her expression relaxed. Young Mistress Phyllis will be fine. This is your work uniform. You can only enter the kitchen after putting it on. You can change in the bathroom on the left on the second floor. After a short while, Mag came downstairs and handed Phyllis a set of chef's uniform that was also black and white. Ow! All right. Phyllis took the chef's uniform and blushed again. She quickly walked up the stairs and looked at the uniform in her hands, feeling as if she were holding a hot potato. A man's uniform. What do I do? Do I really have to wear it? But if I don't wear it, I can't enter the kitchen. But if I wear it, this is a man's uniform. Phyllis quickly went into the bathroom on the second floor and closed the door, fanning her burning cheeks with her hand. A warm light lit up the bathroom, and the bright and clean mirror reflected her bright red face. The milky white marble floor looked very comfortable, and there was a very big white bathtub behind a translucent glass partition. After taking a few deep breaths, Phyllis put the clothes in her hands on the rack at the side, and then began to change. Is it really that small? When she took off her clothes, she couldn't help but look at her body in front of the mirror for a while. Then, she picked up the clothes at the side with a dejected expression and put them on. It actually fits. Phyllis looked at herself in the mirror after putting on the clothes. The clothes fit perfectly, as if they were tailor-made for her. Even her shoes fit perfectly. Furthermore, the style of this set of clothes was slightly different from that of Mag's. The waist was more slimming, and the double-breasted buttons were slanted, giving it a softer appearance. The white hat on her head was a little shorter, and she was also wearing a black apron around her waist. She wore a pair of black casual pants and a pair of black flat-soled shoes on her feet. The style is a little peculiar, but I feel very special after putting it on. Phyllis looked at herself in the mirror. After putting on the chef suit, she seemed to have shed all of her childishness and become a real chef. She was struck by a holy sense of mission. So these are new clothes. Phyllis stroked the smooth clothes, and a smile appeared on her face, but there was a hint of disappointment in her heart. The dining table was cleaned up, and Phyllis just so happened to come downstairs. Amy said with surprise, "Wow, it's similar to Father's clothes. Is big sister Phyllis going to be the second chef? To be chosen by boss. Phyllis will definitely become an exceptional chef," Mia praised with a hint of envy in her eyes. Phyllis, who was being stared at by everyone, lowered her head and looked down at her shoes in embarrassment. Apart from Alina, she would blush when talking to anyone, let alone being stared at by so many people. Mag looked at Phyllis and nodded with satisfaction. He had positioned Phyllis as a backup chef who could really help in the kitchen, so he had chosen a chef's uniform for her. Seeing that she was a little shy, he said, "You don't have to be in charge of receiving customers. You can wait in the kitchen first. You just have to watch from the side for lunch today." Phyllis nodded. She took a look at the long line outside the restaurant and quickly walked into the kitchen. She heaved a sigh of relief. She wouldn't be able to receive those customers at all. Then let's officially open for business. Mag glanced at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 11:30 a.m. He walked to the door and opened it. "Boss Mag, I finally get to see you." Before Mag could say anything, a resentful voice already sounded. Mag's gaze fell on the dark-skinned fatso standing behind Krasu, and he faltered slightly upon seeing this. Why did he look so familiar? "I'm Abraham." The man's voice became even more resentful. "Duke Abraham, how did you become like this? I thought you had to go back to Rodu." Mag's eyelids twitched, and only after taking a closer look did he realize that this was indeed Abraham. However, he was much darker than when he had first seen him in Rodu, and he had also lost a lot of weight. It had only been 4 or 5 days since they had last met, and Mag was unable to recognize him immediately. What had happened to him in the past few days? "Duke?" Everyone also turned to Abraham with curiosity in their eyes. On the Norland continent, only the Roth Empire had the title of Duke, and all of the dukes held extremely high social statuses. All of them were extremely influential figures in the Roth Empire. Was this middle-aged man also a duke? Why had he come to Chaos City? Let's not talk about that. Abraham wore a conflicted expression. He was a duke of the Roth Empire, after all, and he had almost starved to death because his eagle had been overfed, resulting in a plane crash, and he had almost starved to death after crawling in the mountains for 3 days. It was simply far too humiliating for him to bring up. "Bring it up, bring it up. I want to hear it." Amy sat down on a little stool at the entrance and looked at Abraham with a curious expression as she asked, "Did your big fat bird fall out of the sky because it couldn't fly anymore? Or did you go the wrong way and get lost? You must have missed your morning meal, right?" Abraham's eyes immediately widened, and his lips tremored as he almost blurted out, "Holy fuck. Could it be that this little girl had seen everything?" Amy pinched Ugly Duckling's chubby cheeks with a serious expression and said, "Did you see that, Ugly Duckling? You can't get too fat. If you fall out of the sky in the future, it'll be super embarrassing." Abraham's expression darkened a little. He wanted to find a hole in the ground to hide in as he could sense the amused gazes on him, but he couldn't bear to part with the delicious food that was right in front of him. He had traveled thousands of miles and lost close to 20 kilograms of fat for it. Chapter 870. You're so awesome, Phyllis. You're the first person that boss has allowed you to participate in the cooking process. Mia looked at Phyllis with a hint of amazement in her eyes. She had worked in the kitchen for many years, but after coming to the restaurant, Meg had almost never asked her to help with cooking, not even when it came to preparing ingredients. Phyllis smiled at Mia, and she was also quite happy. Powerful chefs were generally a little arrogant and wouldn't let anyone into their kitchen for no reason. Big sister Irina told me to keep an eye on the big sister, who's trying to get close to father. Amy stood off to the side with ugly duckling in her arms as she appraised Phyllis. She then looked down, and her expression relaxed as she said, "Miss Phyllis will definitely be fine. This is a work uniform. You can only enter the kitchen after putting it on. You can change into it in the bathroom on the left on the second floor." After a short while, Meg came downstairs and handed a black and white chef's uniform to Phyllis. "Ow! All right." Phyllis accepted the chef's uniform, and a blush appeared on her face again. She quickly made her way up the stairs and looked at the uniform in her hands as if she were holding a hot potato. "Men's clothes? What should I do? Do I really have to wear them? But if I don't wear them, I can't enter the kitchen. But if I wear them, these are men's clothes." Phyllis quickly made her way to the bathroom on the second floor and closed the door as she fanned her burning cheeks with her hands. A warm light illuminated the bathroom, and the bright and clean mirror reflected her red cheeks. The floor was paved with white marble, and it was very comfortable to look at. There was a semi-transparent glass partition, and there was a very large white porcelain bathtub in the bathroom. After taking a few deep breaths, Phyllis placed the uniform in her hands onto a nearby rack and then began to change. Is it really that small? After taking off her clothes, she couldn't help but examine her own body in front of the mirror for a while before putting on the uniform with a dejected expression. It actually fits perfectly. Phyllis looked at herself in the mirror. The clothes fit her perfectly, as if they were tailor-made for her. Even the shoes fit her perfectly. Furthermore, the style of this set of clothes was also a little different from Mag's. The slimming effect of the waist was more pronounced, and the double-breasted buttons were diagonally buttoned, giving it a softer appearance. The white hat on her head was shorter, and there was also a black apron around her waist. She wore black casual pants and a pair of flat black leather shoes on her feet. Although the style is a little strange, it gives me a wonderful feeling after I put it on. Phyllis looked at herself in the mirror. After changing out of the floral dress and putting on the chef's suit, she seemed to have shed her childishness and become a real chef. She had a sacred sense of mission. "So it's new clothes?" Phyllis touched her silky clothes, and a smile appeared on her face, but she felt an inexplicable sense of loss in her heart. When the table was cleared, Phyllis came downstairs. Amy said in surprise, "Wow, it's similar to Father's clothes. Will big sister Phyllis be the second chef?" Since she was chosen by boss, Phyllis will definitely become an excellent chef. Mia praised from the bottom of her heart, and there was a hint of envy in her eyes. Phyllis, who was being stared at by everyone, lowered her head and looked at her shoes in embarrassment. Apart from Irina, she would blush whenever she talked to anyone, let alone when she was being stared at by so many people. Meg looked at Phyllis and nodded with satisfaction. He had given Phyllis the position of a chef who could really help out in the kitchen, so he chose a chef's suit for her. Seeing that she was a little shy, he said, "You don't need to be responsible for receiving customers. You can wait in the kitchen. You just need to watch from the side for lunch." "Okay." Phyllis nodded. She glanced at the long line outside the restaurant and hurriedly walked into the kitchen. She secretly breathed a sigh of relief. If he had asked her to receive those customers, she wouldn't be able to do it at all. "Then let's officially open for business." Meg looked at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 11:30. He walked to the door and opened it. "Mr. Mack, I finally get to see you." Before Meg had a chance to say anything, a slightly resentful voice had already sounded. Meg's gaze fell on the slightly tanned, portly man standing behind Crassus, and he faltered slightly. Why did this man look so familiar? "I'm Abraham." The man's voice became even more resentful. "Duke Abraham, how did you become like this? I thought you went back to Rodu to attend to some business." Meg's eyelids twitched. He took a closer look, and only then did he realize that this was indeed Abraham. It was just that he was a few shades darker than when he had first met him in Rodu, and he had also lost a lot of weight. It had only been 4 to 5 days since they last met, and Mag couldn't recognize him due to his plastic surgery. What had happened to him in the past few days? Duke? Everyone also turned to look at Abraham with curiosity in their eyes. On the Norland continent, only the Roth Empire had the title of Duke. Furthermore, dukes held extremely high statuses, and all of them were extremely important figures in the Roth Empire. However, this middle-aged man with a dark complexion was also a duke? Why had he come to Chaos City in the first place? Let's not talk about it. Abraham was at a loss for words. He was a duke of the Roth Empire, after all. His eagle had been fed too much, resulting in a plane crash. After that, he had to crawl in the mountains for 3 days and almost starve to death. It was simply too embarrassing. How could he bring himself to talk about this? Bring it up. I really want to hear about it. Amy had taken a small stool and sat down at the entrance of the restaurant. She looked at Abraham with a curious expression and asked, "Did your big fat bird fall from the sky because it couldn't fly anymore? Or did you go in the wrong direction and get lost? Also, you must have missed your morning meal, right?" Abraham's eyes widened and his lips trembled. He almost couldn't help but curse. Could it be that this little girl had seen everything? Amy pinched Ugly Duckling's chubby cheeks with a serious expression and said, "Did you see that, Ugly Duckling? You can't get too fat. If you fall from the sky in the future, it'll be super embarrassing." Abraham's expression darkened slightly. He could sense everyone looking at him with amusement in their eyes, and he really wanted to find a hole to hide in. However, he couldn't bear to part with the delicious food that was right in front of him. He had traveled countless mountains and rivers and lost close to 10 kilograms of fat for it. Chapter 871. Even though Abraham was feeling quite conflicted, he still strode into the restaurant without any hesitation. In the face of delicious food, all of this was nothing. All of the customers who had been waiting for a long time also filed into the restaurant, and soon, all of them were seated. Abraham, male, 43 years of age, normal human. Symptoms: abdomen swelling, multiple ulcers in his stomach, gastric acid reflux, poor elasticity of his intestines, difficulty in urinating. Diagnosis: excessive turbidity, chronic gastric ulcers and severe inflammation, at risk of developing gastric cancer, constipation. Vicenio, male, 29 years of age, normal human. Symptoms: pale complexion, dry skin, weak waist and knees, mental fatigue, cold limbs, dizziness, tinnitus, low back pain, memory loss. Diagnosis: severe kidney deficiency. Harrison, in the kitchen, Mag looked at one message after another with a grave expression. This was the first time that he had opened the omniscient door after its upgrade, or rather, the door of physical examination. All of the customers who appeared to be normal all had some ailments that made him feel a little concerned after entering through the door. Of course, Vicenio was an exception. This man had always appeared to be suffering from kidney deficiency, and it would be strange if the system hadn't detected this. However, Abraham's stomach seemed to be quite problematic. It was common knowledge that overeating was harmful to one's stomach. Back in the day, he had been able to restrain himself, but due to his obsession with novelty, he still had some issues with his stomach. Abraham's problem was clearly far more serious than his. If he didn't take good care of himself, he could develop gastric cancer, which would be a terminal illness. By the way, is cancer considered a terminal illness in this world? Meg thought to himself with a curious expression. After all, this was an alternate world, and severe injuries could be healed with a single healing spell. However, he wasn't sure if cancer could be treated. In any case, Abraham's digestive issues should at least be warned that there was a high chance that he would develop a disease. Yabamiya began to order the customers in the order that they had entered the restaurant. There were many customers, but the restaurant was completely quiet. All of the customers were seated peacefully, and even when they were conversing with one another, they were all speaking in hushed tones. There was no loud chatter, nor any discordant arguments. Abraham glanced at the ferocious-looking Minotaur demon and the tall orc sitting beside him, and felt a little uncomfortable. He finally understood why Meg had made a bet with the head chef of Carrie's rotisserie back in Rodu. There was no enmity between them. He simply couldn't stand the sight of Carrie's rotisserie. In Mamie's, not only was there no distinction between commoners and nobles, there were also no restrictions on race. Even as the Duke of the Roth Empire, he had never shared a table with demons and orcs. Abraham glanced at the man sitting across from him, who seemed to be from the holy ground. He didn't show any fear as he sat beside the Minotaur demon. He seemed to be used to this and gradually relaxed. "Hello. What would you like to order?" Yabamiya quickly approached her and asked with a smile. "Let me see." Abraham picked up the menu on the table, and as soon as he opened it, he was greeted by a series of delicacies accompanied by pictures. Spicy grilled fish, fragrant steak, tempting rigiamo. Every single dish looked so enticing that Abraham couldn't help but salivate. Which one? Only children make choices. Abraham closed the menu and turned to Yabamiya with a smile as he said, "I'd like to have a portion of everything on the menu. Please order the dishes for me, Mr. Mack." "All of them?" Yabamiya was a little hesitant as he looked at Abraham. Giant dragons, trolls, and demons did indeed have much larger appetites than the average human, but Abraham was only a normal human. How could he eat so much? All of the surrounding customers were also looking at Abraham with befuddled expressions. Setting aside how much it would cost to serve all of the dishes on the menu, just the fact that he had to eat all of them was already beyond the ability of a normal human. After all, humans only had one stomach. Yes, all of them. Abraham nodded with a firm expression. He hadn't eaten properly for many days in preparation for this meal. He had been waiting in line ever since he arrived late in the morning, and his stomach was completely empty. He didn't want to miss out on any of these delicacies. "All right, please wait a moment." Yabamiya glanced at Abraham and didn't ask any further questions as he nodded. "Did you purposely come here to eat after starving for a few days?" Vicenio, who was sitting in the opposite corner, looked at Abraham in surprise. Even though he had been eating at Mamie's every day, he had still underestimated the thirst of a young woman in her 30s. Instead, his body was getting weaker and weaker. He was glad that his wife didn't know about Mamie's yet. Otherwise, he couldn't imagine how crazy a woman would become after eating rigiamo. "I don't refuse any delicacies." Abraham nodded with a smile. He looked at the only human at the table, and his gaze became much friendlier. In the past, he would never have the chance to sit at the same table as a commoner. However, when he looked at Vicenio's sunken eyes, he said meaningfully, "Young man, you should still control yourself. Otherwise, when you get older, you'll only be able to shed tears for nothing." Alas! Vicenio covered his face with his hands and sighed deeply. As a pretty boy, there were always gains and losses. He had one foot in a pirate ship, and there was no way out. His body couldn't take it. No one knew better than him that his body couldn't take it. He had wanted to rely on Mr. Mack's food to turn over a new leaf, but he was still being pressed down by Mr. Mack's body, and it was even more intense than before. "Wait a moment." Meg, who was about to start cooking, hesitated for a moment when he heard Abraham's order. Then, he put down the spatula in his hand and walked out of the kitchen. He went straight to Abraham and said with a smile, "Duke Abraham, although the restaurant doesn't interfere with the customer's orders, for the sake of your health, I suggest you order 2 or 3 dishes and choose something lighter." "Why? I'm in good health. There is so many delicious food here. How can 2 or 3 dishes be enough? Of course, the heavier the taste, the better. Are you sure you're not mistaken, Mag?" Abraham looked at Mag with a perplexed expression and patted his own chest as he spoke. The customers also looked at Meg curiously. Usually, Meg never interfered with the customer's orders. What was wrong with him today? Why did he reject the business that was delivered to his door? Chapter 872. How? How did you know? Abraham stared at Meg with incredulity in his eyes. He had thought that Meg was making a mountain out of a molehill. Meg was right. He had been suffering from these symptoms for many years. In the beginning, he didn't think much of it. But recently, the symptoms had become more and more pronounced. Sometimes he would be woken up by the pain in the middle of the night, so he had reluctantly called for a doctor. Even the royal doctors in the palace had treated him. The problem was in his stomach, and the healing magic caster's magic had alleviated many of the symptoms. However, all of the doctors had the same request: to reduce the amount of food he ate and to use plain porridge as the main ingredient for long-term recuperation. This kind of treatment was no different from torture to him, so he naturally refused. If he couldn't even enjoy delicious food, then he might as well kill himself. Whenever he felt uncomfortable, he would ask the magic casters to give him a pain reduction buff before rushing to the next restaurant. He was still living a carefree life, but he didn't think that Meg would be able to see through him so easily. Can Mr. Mack still treat patients? The customers looked at Meg with surprise upon seeing Abraham's expression. They were all curious as to how he had been able to tell. Meg looked at Abraham calmly and said, "I'm quite familiar with food, so I have some understanding of the problems caused by eating. Duke Abraham's symptoms are already quite pronounced, and if they aren't controlled and treated, they could flare up in the short term. In the worst-case scenario, death is the only outcome. The food I make is for everyone to enjoy. I don't want to see anyone get hurt because of it." Due to the superior quality of the ingredients, all of the dishes in the restaurant were very beneficial to the human body. Some of them even had miraculous effects. However, even a pill that could prolong one's life could cause one to die from overeating, let alone a patient with severe gastrointestinal problems. After a long period of gastric ulcers, the stomach had become very fragile. If one ate too much, it was very likely that gastric bleeding and gastric perforation would result. One portion of each dish on the menu was enough to feed 4 or 5 normal people. I didn't kill Boren, but Boren died because of me. Meg couldn't sit by and watch all of this happen, so he had to stop it, even if it was somewhat inconsistent with his character. Is it that serious? Abraham was also feeling a little sheepish at the sight of Mag's serious expression. All of the doctors had told him about the severity of the problem, but he hadn't taken them to heart. He only thought that eating delicious food was a very enjoyable thing, and that there was no way anyone would fall ill from eating delicious food. However, the one who said that was Meg, a chef who had created many delicious dishes. The taste of the dishes changed instantly. He respected every chef who could make delicious food and did not care about their status. This was because only those who had a deep enough understanding of food and ingredients could make delicious food. This was an ability that ordinary people did not have. When the problem in his stomach flared up, the burning and swelling pain became more and more obvious. Even healing magic could not completely suppress them. However, he had never thought that this problem was caused by eating delicious food, and that it would continue to worsen because of eating. Naturally, he felt a little uneasy. He only had one life, and he hadn't lived enough yet. Not to mention, he had just discovered such a treasure trove. Aside from the spicy grilled fish, black pepper steak, and braised chicken and rice, there were so many delicious dishes on the menu. How could he just die like that? That's right. I'm sure the doctors have already given you more professional advice. For the sake of your health, I hope you can nurse your stomach back to health so that you can enjoy more delicious food. Meg nodded with a smile. Thankfully, Abraham wasn't as stubborn as he had imagined. Then all right. Abraham flipped open the menu again and carefully looked at it for a while before saying, "I'll have a fried rice, a sweet tofu pudding, and a braised chicken and rice." "All right, please wait a moment." Meg nodded and turned toward the kitchen. Even though this was still a little more than the average person, it was still a lot less for Abraham, so it was a good start. Furthermore, these dishes were all very mild and would definitely be beneficial to his health. Mr. Mack is so godlike. He can even diagnose my illness. Chef plus doctor equals Mr. Mack? That's quite impressive. I want Mr. Mack to take a look at me. Recently, my head has been feeling a little tight, as if it's being strangled by something. Sir, you don't have to trouble Mr. Mack with that. Just loosen the scarf on your head a little, and your symptoms will be alleviated immediately. Wearing a chef's uniform to treat a patient. Isn't he too handsome? He really is my favorite Mr. Mack. Hey, young man, calm down. Mr. Mack is also a man. So what if he's a man? Didn't you see that none of those women got him? Maybe Mr. Mac likes men? Heh, I'm definitely going to be the lady boss of Mamie's. Because of this small episode, the customers began to whisper among themselves. After all, who didn't suffer from illness? It was just that most people were too lazy to see a doctor most of the time. Furthermore, normal doctors couldn't diagnose the problem with just a few glances like Meg, so they were all looking forward to seeing Meg take a look at their illnesses. He actually knows how to treat illnesses? Phyrus turned to Mag with a surprised look on her face. Elves practiced nature magic, and most of them were quite talented in healing magic. However, even the most powerful healing magic casters in the elven race couldn't pinpoint the exact location of a patient's illness just by looking at them. Boss, you're really amazing. Yabamiya looked at Meg with admiration. System, why don't I open up a clinic part-time? This is a much more profitable business than selling vegetables. You just have to be in charge of making medicine for me. Meg listened to the customer's conversation and said in his mind with a smile, Host, as a candidate for the god of cookery, your culinary skills have yet to reach perfection. How can you put the cart before the horse and think about such things? Furthermore, a truly powerful god of cookery doesn't need to sell medicine. Every dish he makes is a good medicine that brings good health to the customers. The system's arrogant voice sounded. Dishes are medicine? Then is he the god of cookery or the king of medicine? Meg raised his eyebrows. Customer, Mr. Mac, what should I do about my illness? There's no problem with your illness. Order a spicy grilled fish and a Yangzhou fried rice. Eat them together, and you'll be cured. Chapter 873. Meg turned on the stove, turned to look at Phyllis, and said with a smile, I'm not used to explaining while I'm cooking. It's disrespectful to both the food and the guests. So, you just watch at noon. Try to understand as much as you can. Okay. Phyllis nodded seriously, her little face full of seriousness. Meg didn't say anything else. He poured a spoonful of oil into the wok and heated it up. Spices were added into the wok, and the aroma began to spread. All kinds of ingredients were poured into the wok in an orderly manner. The wok and spatula danced in Meg's hands, jumping high and then landing lightly. His movements were as smooth as flowing water. Phyllis watched him in a daze. She used the strictest standards to ensure that every step of her cooking was perfect, ensuring that the taste of the food was rigorous and stable, but in the end, she still seemed a little rigid in the process. However, watching Mag cook was a type of visual pleasure. His lithe and fit body seemed to have fused as one with the iron pot in his hand, and the extremely heavy black iron pot danced in his hand like a feather. His movements were very pleasing to the eye, and the onlookers couldn't help but be immersed in the sight of him. And this was just the beginning. 1 wok, 2 wok, 3 wok for wok. Mag was cooking 4 pots at once, and he was making 2 portions of Yangzhou fried rice and black pepper steak at once. There were also over 100 kebabs on the grill beside him, and Mag was moving between the pots in a very efficient manner. The fried rice was out of the wok, the steaks were placed on the plates, and the kebabs were sprinkled with cumin powder. One after another, delicious dishes were brought out of the kitchen and delivered to the guest tables. Phyllis's eyes became brighter and brighter. If it were her, she wouldn't be able to cook as fast as Meg, even if she only cooked 1 dish, let alone multitasking and cooking so many dishes at the same time. What was more amazing was that even though he was cooking so many dishes at once, every dish still looked so perfect. There was no difference in color between the dishes. Just looking at them, she could feel the tempting taste. The dense aroma in the air made her salivate even though she had already eaten lunch. The guests' praises kept coming from outside. Their faces were filled with happy smiles, as if the delicious food in front of them was the only thing left in their eyes. Happiness came so easily. Phyllis didn't doubt their feelings, because she had tasted that delicacy this afternoon. It was a taste that could heal everything. If it's possible, I want to be such a chef too. Phyllis gazed at Meg as an idea that she had never had before arose from the bottom of her heart and took hold of her heart. Ever since she was sensible, she had only had Princess Irina in her life. She had learned floral arts, culinary arts, and back massages. Everything she had done was to better serve Her Highness, and make her feel comfortable and happy. Yes, she had never thought about what she wanted to do. In her world, there was only the princess. And now, for the first time, she wanted to do something for herself. Perhaps it was because he had left the forest, or perhaps he had seen a wider world. The princess was still important in her heart, but this sudden thought was hard to erase. To become a chef who could cook for his customers, a chef who could bring happiness to his customers. It was a bold and clear goal. Princess should agree, right? Phyllis was a little concerned, but a determined look appeared in her eyes as she looked at Meg, who was working tirelessly in front of the stove. Here's your Yangzhou fried rice. Yabamiya served the first dish to Abraham. Abraham's eyes immediately lit up upon hearing Meg's words. Fried rice was a commoner's dish that could occasionally be seen on the streets of Rodu. It was usually fried with rice and eggs, and different chefs would occasionally add other ingredients into the dish. However, most fried rice was made with eggs and rice as the main ingredient. As a veteran foodie, Abraham had tasted fried rice before, but aside from the one on the Rinna food street, which was quite good, he had never tasted any fried rice that made him want to try it again. It was also fried rice, but the appearance of the so-called Yangzhou fried rice in front of him surprised him a little. All of the ingredients were mixed together, and it appeared to be a little messy. In the eyes of professional chefs, this was a low-level cooking method, as the differences between different ingredients would affect one another. If too many ingredients were mixed together, it would be very difficult to combine them. However, the delicious aroma wafting toward him seemed to refute his thoughts. The aromas of the eggs and all of the other ingredients were so rich that he was unable to make up his mind. After calming himself down, Abraham took a closer look, and the surprise in his eyes became even more pronounced. All of the ingredients had been sliced to the size of grains of rice. Even the green beans had been sliced to the size of grains of rice. What was even more astonishing to him were the eggs that were wrapped around the rice. Unlike the fried rice that he usually saw, where the eggs were separated from the rice, the eggs in this fried rice were perfectly wrapped around the rice. Every single grain of rice was shimmering with golden light, and there wasn't even the slightest hint of adhesion. How did he do this? Abraham murmured to himself in shock. He had never seen fried rice like this before. As the aroma in the air grew stronger, his hungry stomach began to rumble. He couldn't help but pick up the spoon and put a spoonful of fried rice into his mouth. The fragrance of the chopped green onions and the eggs assailed his nostrils. The eggs that were wrapped around the rice almost melted in his mouth. The grain-sized shrimp and ham had a very delicate texture, and the egg-wrapped rice was full of sweetness after being chewed. The flavors of all of the ingredients melted in his mouth and continuously assaulted his taste buds. Even after swallowing, the aroma still filled his mouth. This taste is simply amazing. Abraham's face was full of shock. All of his previous doubts had disappeared. The variety of ingredients didn't affect the taste of the fried rice in the slightest. Instead, it added a rich texture and layers to the originally ordinary fried rice. I didn't expect such a simple fried rice to be able to make such a wonderful taste. As expected of Mr. Mac, Abraham couldn't help but pick up the spoon again, savoring the delicacies one mouthful after another. He felt as if the sufferings he had suffered over the past few days were nothing at all, and he was completely healed by this sense of bliss. Ding! The spoon came into contact with the plate, and Abraham lowered his head to look at the empty plate. He raised his hand with a dissatisfied expression and said, "Waiter, please give me another. No, 3 servings." "Sir, didn't you agree to what the owner said just now?" Yabamiya looked at Abraham with a resigned expression. Well, Abraham's expression immediately fell. He looked toward the kitchen, and after a brief internal struggle, he sighed and said, "Maybe next time. Delicious food is right in front of me, but I can't eat more. This is so painful." Abraham looked toward the kitchen with a hint of resentment. Chapter 874. Through the omniscient door, Meg could see that many of the customers were suffering from various ailments. However, he didn't remind them of each and every one of them. No one was completely healthy in this world, and it was normal for them to suffer from some minor ailments. Furthermore, he was a chef, and he owned a restaurant. If he were to treat the patients, he would be overstepping his boundaries. Being able to perform physical examinations didn't mean that he was able to treat patients. This was something that Meg was still aware of. However, when it came to some of his regular customers, if they really did suffer from serious ailments, Meg would make a mental note of them. Even though he didn't know how to treat illnesses, he would still remind them of their ailments. It wasn't in his nature to keep things to himself. During the process of cooking, Meg silently glanced at Phyllis, who was looking at him with a serious expression. He was quite pleased with her attitude, and he was quite interested in teaching her. Meg had once read a saying, "Not all successful people in this world are geniuses, but most of them are hard-working people." When it came to cooking, he was, of course, an idiot. Although he had the help of the system and the perfect experience, he was able to walk out of the test field for the god of cookery again and again. In the end, he relied on his unyielding spirit. Phyllis was quite talented, and it seemed that her temperament was quite good as well. "Miss Mia, are you sure you won't be able to eat stinky tofu for lunch today? Can you ask Mr. Mac to make a portion for me? After eating it yesterday, my mind was filled with stinky tofu, and I couldn't concentrate." Harrison looked at Yabamiya with an expectant expression. "Yeah, I want to eat it too. The taste is simply too unforgettable. If Mr. Mac is willing to make it, count me in too." A few other customers immediately chimed in as they looked at Yabamiya with expectant expressions. "No, the boss said that stinky tofu is only available at night, and only 100 portions a day until they are sold out." Yabamiya shook his head, and there was no room for negotiation. Sigh. Harrison and the other customers were immediately discouraged. However, they were already thinking that they had to come earlier tonight. Stinky tofu? What was that? Why isn't it on the menu? Abraham was enjoying his tofu pudding with a curious expression. Generally, the things that the customers could not forget were all good things. This was one of the experiences he had summed up over the years. Vicenio continued, "That's a new dish that Mr. Mac just released yesterday. It's only available in limited quantities every night, but it's said to be extremely smelly. It's not something that ordinary people can stomach. Anyway, I don't want to try it." "Super smelly?" Abraham was a little surprised. He claimed to have tasted all the delicacies in the world, but he had never tasted anything so smelly. Color, aroma, and taste were all indispensable to a real delicacy, not to mention turning the aroma into a stench. But why was this food, which was said to be extremely smelly, so much so that the customers could not forget about it? The curiosity in Abraham's heart grew. That's right. It's said to be an unforgettable smell. When it was first brought out, all of the customers who ordered it had a huge reaction. There was even one who rushed out of the door. Little Boss almost thought that he was trying to dine and dash, and he was put out with a fireball. Vicenio nodded. He still had some lingering fear when he thought of the fireball that followed that customer out of the door yesterday. If that customer hadn't turned around in time, that fireball would have most likely landed on him. "I didn't know that." Abraham was even more surprised. What kind of stinky smell could elicit such a reaction? Exactly. Vicenio was also very curious. After all, there were many people in the world who liked to eat delicious food, but this was the first time he had seen someone who liked to eat stinky food. You've never tasted it, so you don't understand. When the aroma reaches its peak, it becomes a stench, and when the stench reaches its peak, it naturally becomes fragrant. Only those who have tasted it can understand the taste, Harrison said leisurely. His gaze gradually shifted upward, and he felt as if he had transcended to another level. "I have to try such an interesting dish tonight. If it really stinks, then so be it, but it would be a pity to miss out on such a delicious dish," Abraham thought to himself. Abraham thought silently in his heart. Seeing that the bowl in his hand was almost empty, although he still wanted to continue, he still took the money and paid the bill before leaving. "I haven't taken a single step out of Rodu in 45 years. I feel like I'll never be able to leave Chaos City for the rest of my life." Abraham walked out of the restaurant and turned back to look at the restaurant's signboard with a forlorn expression. The busy lunch hour had come to an end, and Meg put down the iron pot in his hand. He turned off all of the fires on the stoves and heaved a sigh of relief. He was just about to wipe the sweat off his forehead when a warm towel was handed to him. Mag was slightly taken aback. He looked up at Phyrus, who was holding the towel with a blushing face. He hesitated for a moment, but still took the towel and wiped his forehead and hands. After that, he handed the towel back to Phyrus with a smile. You're welcome." Phyrus' blush deepened, and she quickly strode out of the restaurant with the towel in her hand. This was the first time that she had served someone other than the princess, and she felt as if her heart were about to leap out of her chest. However, she did it out of respect and admiration from the bottom of her heart. She couldn't imagine that an ordinary person could bring so many delicacies and happy smiles to so many guests in just over an hour. In her heart, Mag's image seemed to have grown taller like a giant. "Big Sister Phyrus, why are your cheeks so red?" Amy, who was holding Ugly Duckling in her arms, turned to Phyrus with a curious look on her face. Phyrus was a little dazed, and she immediately choked on her words. "It must be because Father's smile is too beautiful, right?" Amy continued with a smile. The image of Meg's warm smile immediately appeared in Phyrus' mind. It was indeed very beautiful. "It's all right. Father smiles like that to everyone, and he doesn't have any special feelings for you," Amy said. "Phyrus." Sally used water-type magic to completely clean the restaurant and kitchen, and the lunch service was officially over. "Goodbye, boss." "Amy," Phyrus. "We're going to the ice cream shop now," Yabamiya said to everyone with a smile as she picked up her little backpack. "I'm going back to sleep and read." "Goodbye," Barbara said before leaving with Mia and the others. Thus, only Meg, Amy, and Phyrus were left in the restaurant. Phyllis was a little embarrassed, but she still couldn't think of anywhere she could go, and that made her even more embarrassed. She looked down at the tips of her shoes. Not daring to look at Meg could roughly guess what Phyrus was thinking at the sight of the reserved Phyrus. He smiled and said, "If you don't have anywhere else to go, you can rest in the restaurant. I'll teach you some things that you can do in the afternoon. I almost forgot that tomorrow is the restaurant's off day, so you'll have to start work a day later. However, the restaurant is going to be expanded and upgraded soon, so you'll have to learn how to cook for the customers after you start work." Phyrus immediately looked up at Meg's expectant and trusting eyes, and a warm feeling welled up in her heart. She nodded solemnly and said, "I'll do my best." "Phyrus? Why is she here?" Chapter 875. It had been close to a month since Snare arrived at Chaos City, and he had been searching for Alex this entire time. However, a piece of shocking news had arrived from Rodu a few days ago. Alex was still alive, and had slain 4 10th-tier powerful beings on his own, including the patriarch of the spatial demon race, Benson. This was a piece of news that the entire continent had never expected, including Snare, who was searching for Alex in Chaos City. During his 3 years of investigation, he had gathered countless pieces of information, all of which pointed to the fact that Alex had been completely crippled, and that there was no way for him to recover from those injuries. Otherwise, those beings who stood at the pinnacle of the Norland continent definitely wouldn't have allowed Alex to live so easily on that rainy night. They had allowed him to live because they wanted to see him suffer more than death. However, he had returned 3 years later and was still as unstoppable as ever. All of the beings who had participated in that incident were in complete disbelief. Even a god wouldn't be able to recover from injuries like that. Snare was also in disbelief. If this was true, then those beings who had allowed Alex to live all those years ago must have been incredibly stupid. To be able to become a level 10 expert, all of them were 1 in a million. How could they make such a low-level mistake? However, there was only one knight in the entire history of the Norland continent who was able to slay 3 10th-tier powerful beings on his own, and that was Alex. Of course, the most important thing was that the purple-striped griffin that had also disappeared for 3 years had also reappeared. Aside from Alex, no one else in this world was able to control it. This news had shaken the entire continent, and countless powerful beings were unable to sleep peacefully. Countless powerful beings who stood at the pinnacle of the continent had no choice but to turn the tables. Snare was elated that the princess had reunited with Alex, and he wasn't resentful in the slightest for the past 3 years. This was undoubtedly the best piece of news he had ever heard. Just as he was about to return to the Wind Forest to report on his progress, another piece of shocking news came from the Wind Forest. Princess Irina had been removed from her position as princess by the panel of elders. That short sentence also created quite a stir on the Norland continent. If it weren't for Alex, Irina would definitely be the most powerful being of the younger generation on the continent. She was able to kill 3 of the 6/10th tier powerful beings at once, and that was a feat that even the most powerful beings of the continent might not be able to accomplish. With the long lifespan of elves, it was unimaginable just what kind of power she would reach in the future. However, to everyone's surprise, the next elven queen, Irina, had been removed from her position of power. Snare was quite surprised to hear this, but he could guess what was going on. He had heard that Alex had also appeared in the Wind Forest, and that Irina had been stripped of her position as princess, so she had gone into seclusion. In the end, things didn't turn out to be as bad as they seemed. As Irina's trusted subordinate, he naturally couldn't return to the Wind Forest. Instead, he was most concerned about Phyllis. He had heard that Alex had come to Chaos City a few days ago, and had announced that he was going to oppose the mercenary squad that had captured elves. He was accompanied by an elven maiden, so he had been wandering around Chaos City for the past 2 days. Not only did he want to tie up all of the loose ends, but he also wanted to find Phyllis. He didn't think that he would see Phyllis here, and he was both elated and confused. During this period of time, he had spent a lot of effort searching for Alex and his daughter. Even though he hadn't been able to find any concrete information, after all of his efforts in Rodu, he deduced that this was the place where Alex and his daughter were most likely to be. After investigating all of the half-elves in Chaos City, the last piece of information he had found pointed to this restaurant by the name of Mamie. Alex had already appeared, so there was no need for him to investigate this restaurant. However, Snare had been doing this for 3 years, and he wanted to finish what he had started. As such, he came to this restaurant in disguise, and to his surprise, he was greeted by the sight of Phyllis in the restaurant. Judging from her attire, could it be that she's already an employee of this restaurant? Is this just a coincidence, or is this some kind of arrangement? Snare turned slightly to the side and appraised Meg out of the corner of his eye. Huh? Uncle Straw Hat, your straw hat is really pretty. Did you weave it yourself? Just as Snare was deep in thought, the restaurant's door was opened, and a little half-elf girl looked at him with a curious expression. Snare's eyes immediately lit up with incredulity. The little half-elf girl had blue eyes and long silver hair. Her pointy little ears twitched slightly, and her intricate features looked as if they had been carved from the most standard jade. She looked so much like Princess Irina when she was a child. Snare still appeared to be a young man, but he was actually already over 200 years old, so he could only be considered a junior in the elven race. As an existence appointed by Her Majesty to protect Princess Irina, he had watched her grow up. Although his current strength was far inferior to Her Majesty's, he still remembered every detail of Her Majesty's appearance since she was a child. This little girl was a half-elf, but her features were virtually identical to those of Princess Irina when she was a child, so how could he not be surprised? Can't you speak? Are you a mute? A sympathetic look immediately appeared in Amy's eyes. She thought to herself for a moment before carefully pulling out a copper coin and handing it over to Snare as she whispered, "Uncle Straw Hat, go buy something to eat. I've been saving this in secret, so don't let Father know about it." Snare looked at the copper coin in her little hand and the innocent smile on her intricate little face, and for a moment, he felt as if he were looking at the little princess with a snowball in her hand. He was wearing tattered clothes and an old straw hat, so he really did look no different from a homeless man. After a brief hesitation, Snare accepted the copper coin and turned to Amy with a smile. He then took a final glance at the restaurant before slowly departing. Regardless of whether his suspicions were correct or not, the only thing he could do now was to not disturb her. As for learning more about the situation in the Wind Forest from Phyrus, it would be best to wait until the right time to do so. When Alex had appeared in Rodu, the restaurant's owner had gone to Rodu to cook for the king. 2 days ago, when Alex had appeared in the Wind Forest in Chaos City, the owner of this restaurant had taken a day off to gather ingredients. Things like coincidences would become a fact once they were repeated. With that in mind, Snare quickened his pace and disappeared from the plaza in the blink of an eye. What a strange Uncle Straw Hat. Amy shook her head as she put Ugly Duckling down at the entrance of the restaurant. Chapter 876. That's me. Amy nodded as she looked at the middle-aged man. Air. The man scratched his head in a resigned manner at the sight of Amy's serious expression. I'm saying that the owner of this restaurant might be your father. What's the matter? Meg walked out upon hearing the conversation and turned to the man in the Catering Association uniform. The Catering Association hadn't appeared in his life for a long time. After the last competition, it was said that the Catering Association had undergone a reorganization and had announced that the Aiden Square Food Competition would be suspended indefinitely. After the reorganization, the Catering Association had disappeared for 3 months. The man's expression immediately lit up at the sight of Meg, and he hurriedly said, "You're the owner of Amy's, right? After the reorganization and improvement of the Catering Association, we're going to launch a new Aiden Square Food Competition, and we're currently looking for participating restaurants. Amy's had 5 dishes in the top 100 in the last competition, and they're very powerful. Would you like to participate this time?" A new ranking? A contemplative look appeared on Meg's face. Amy's was already very famous, and there was no need for them to increase their popularity. Furthermore, if the process was still as cumbersome as before, and he had to pay for his own ticket, then he naturally had no desire to participate. The man could see the hesitation on Meg's face, and he hurriedly said, "The rules of the Aiden Square Food Competition this time are completely different from before. Due to the severe fraud that occurred in the past, we've canceled the selection process by voting for our customers. Instead, 12 anonymous expert judges will conduct a cross-examination of the restaurants, then give a fair evaluation. After that, the final evaluation will be compiled, and the final ranking will be obtained. This includes evaluation of the dining environment and the taste of the food. Furthermore, aside from the overall ranking, there are also 5 sub-rankings, each of which has 20 people. They are meat rankings, seafood rankings, soup rankings, vegetarian rankings, and snack rankings. All participating restaurants don't have to pay any fees, and the judges will dine in the restaurant as normal customers. They won't inform the restaurant, and the restaurant will accept all of the evaluation. The rules have changed quite a bit." Meg nodded slightly. This rule was somewhat similar to the evaluation standards of Michelin restaurants. The system of anonymous expert judges could greatly prevent fraud and bring a more objective evaluation of the food. On the other hand, the settings of the main ranking list and the sub-ranking list were more user-friendly. After all, the original purpose of the gourmet rankings was to better recommend delicious food to the diners. This could be considered as returning to the original intention. Of course, the most important thing was the simplification of the process. All the restaurants had to do was register, and there was no need to expend any manpower or resources on this. This improvement was undoubtedly a stark contrast to the previous Catering Association. However, Meg was still not interested. Now that the restaurant needed to limit the flow of customers, there was no point in continuing to attract customers. He was not the kind of person who wanted to be first in everything. Ding! New mission. Host, please participate in the Gourmet Cuisine Ranking Competition and obtain first place in all rankings. Just as Meg was about to decline, the system's voice suddenly sounded. Question mark. Meg raised his eyebrows. Mission completion reward. A chance to use the god of cooking's wheel of advancement. Mission failure penalty. Dress as a woman and dance to the Gokura Kajodo in front of the restaurant. What the fuck? Meg almost couldn't help but curse out loud. System, are you fucking taking revenge on me? Meg was furious in his heart. First place on the overall ranking list was one thing, but first place on all the sub-ranking lists as well? There was also a sub-ranking list for vegetables. How could there be vegetables on the restaurant's menu? This was fucking forcing him to dress as a woman and dance to the Gokura Kajodo. If you have the conditions, you have to do it. If you don't have the conditions, you have to create the conditions. Host, you have to have the spirit of a man of iron. Only then will you be able to walk further and further on the path to becoming the god of cooking. Furthermore, I'm sure you'll look very beautiful in women's clothing. Fuck off. Meg resisted the urge to flip the table. He looked at the expectant employee and squeezed out a few words through gritted teeth. I'll participate. Okay. This is the agreement. Please take a look. If there is no problem, you can sign it here. The employee was overjoyed and handed the agreement to Meg. Meg glanced at it briefly. The agreement was very simple. It was similar to what the employee had said before. There were no additional clauses. It only confirmed that the restaurant would participate in the competition and voluntarily accept the evaluation from the judges. Then, he picked up the pen and signed his name and the name of the restaurant. I believe Amy's will be able to get a very good ranking. The employee took the agreement and said sincerely. Then he turned and left. Meg, the first place of the 6 rankings was simply not giving him a way out. System, can you explain to me what the hell is the Gokura Kujodo in women's clothing? Meg turned and walked towards the restaurant. The mission has been issued. Please try your best to complete it. The explanation of this mission belongs to the system. As for the question of the host, the system chooses not to explain. The voice of the system had a hint of a smile, and then it completely disappeared. Fuck! Meg rubbed his eyebrows and couldn't help but mutter. He wasn't worried that he wouldn't be able to get first place in the overall rankings and the other rankings. But what about the vegetable rankings? The only dish that hadn't been introduced yet was the Peking duck. No matter how he tried to pass it off as a vegetable dish, there was no way to pass it off as a vegetable dish. Phyllis, who had been looking forward to Meg teaching her how to cook, was startled. She carefully looked at the frowning Meg. She didn't know what she had done wrong to make him so angry. After hesitating for a while, she whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" Meg suddenly looked up at Phyllis. He was a little surprised and whispered to himself, "How about frying a bean sprout?" Phyllis was still feeling a little uneasy, but a blush immediately appeared on her face. That was a title that only the princess would use on her. As for the reason, in any case, she was very embarrassed to hear Mag call her that. Bean sprout? It sounds so good. Then from now on, I'll call you Big Sister Phyllis or Big Sister Bean Sprout. Amy, who had come in at some point, blinked her big eyes and looked at Phyllis. Phyllis opened her mouth and looked at Amy, who was blinking her big eyes. She swallowed the rest of her words and nodded her head. Chapter 877. Amy was studying at Julian's place today, so after dropping her off, Meg took Phyllis to the market. Come and have a look. Fresh Pikachu. Skin it off, and the meat is even more tender than a rabbit. It's a rare first-level lightning magic beast. You can only find it by chance. The ice and fire symbiotic lotus I just picked from the Catcher Snowy Mountain. 1,000 gold coins for one. This treasure can be used to make soup to prolong one's life. Blood python from the Black Swamp. Alive. Only 100 gold coins. That includes killing it, extracting its blood, and extracting its gallbladder. Although this jade blood python is extremely poisonous, its blood and gallbladder are both good for curing poisons. The snake meat can be used to make a pot of snake stew, which is incomparably delicious. As soon as they entered the market, they were greeted by all kinds of greetings. On the meat racks were all kinds of skinned or cut-up meat from magic beasts and livestock. Some had even been butchered on the spot. It was quite a bloody scene. Meg glanced at a magic beast that looked like a penguin in a cage in the corner. Although it was also yellow, this guy didn't seem to have the ability to release 100,000 volts, and it had a mouthful of rotten teeth. Obviously, it couldn't be sold in the pet market. It could only lie in the corner and wait to be eaten. It was Phyllis's first time at the market. Looking at the bloody meat hanging on the meat racks and the animal struggling in the butcher's hands, she subconsciously hid behind Meg, her face slightly pale. Mag turned to look at Phyllis and quickly understood what she was trying to say. He smiled and said, "This is a food market. The residents of Chaos City use money to buy live or processed ingredients here, and then bring them home to cook. This process is slightly different from obtaining ingredients in the wild. Moreover, most of the bosses who are responsible for slaughtering are not hunters. They buy fresh ingredients from hunters or mercenaries and then sell them in the market after processing. This processing can eliminate the intermediate steps of obtaining ingredients. It can be regarded as a division of labor in the entire society. Division of labor? A thoughtful look appeared on Phyllis's face. She then looked at the customers in front of the stalls, who pointed at a piece of meat on the meat rack. After paying a certain amount of gold coins, they could directly take the piece of meat that had already been dehaired. The elves of the Wind Forest had once lived a self-sufficient life. Even now, some of the major families were responsible for hunting, while others were responsible for cooking. However, all of the production was limited to their own families. Unlike here, where they used money as a link to trade with people who were completely unrelated to them. This was a very novel way of doing things. Meg continued, "This is a stage in the development of society. People's productivity has surpassed the stage of self-sufficiency. Excess goods can be traded, and the emergence of currency allows goods to circulate. Of course, most of the places on the Northern continent were already quite developed, and as long as you had money, you could buy most of the goods you wanted. The elves might be a little special. Apart from external transactions, they don't use much currency in the Wind Forest." Currency, goods? Phyllis mused. She had never used currency in the Wind Forest. Everything she needed could be found in the forest or in the storehouse. However, the world outside the forest was not like that. "Let's go and buy some beef first. I'll teach you how to make beef kebabs today," Meg said to Phyllis, who was still thinking. They walked straight to a beef stall. Roasting beef kebabs required a lot of skill and required an extremely high level of control over the sauces and the heat. Furthermore, the kebabs had to be cooked at all times, and Mag had to constantly flip the kebabs to control the heat. If Mag were to focus on multiple things at the same time, he could easily overcook a few kebabs or even destroy the entire batch. It couldn't be better if there was someone who could be responsible for making kebabs. Of course, the most important thing was that many people ordered kebabs, which could support a huge turnover every day. Meg had thought of asking Phyllis to start with Yangzhou fried rice like the system, but on second thought, Yangzhou fried rice was actually above average among all the dishes he had made. Whether it was how to make the eggs perfectly wrap around the rice grains without breaking or sticking together during the frying process, how to make the various ingredients reach the most perfect level at the same time, and the various techniques to control the big iron wok, all of them required a long time of practice. Meg, on the other hand, was a man who could control 4 wok at the same time. After careful consideration, beef kebabs were undoubtedly the best choice for Phyllis. "Is that the one who skewers beef on thin bamboo sticks?" Phyllis asked in a low voice, her voice full of surprise. "Yes," Meg answered casually as he glanced at the beef on the meat rack. The smile on Phyllis's face widened even further. Mag's method of roasting beef was completely different from what she had seen in the past. She had never seen anyone cut beef into small pieces before roasting them on a skewer, but the delectable flavor imbued within that small skewer had left her completely stunned. She was going to find out what kind of secret was hidden in ordinary beef very soon. That feeling made her feel a little excited, but she still looked at Mag carefully as he was choosing the meat. Mag had told her that on the way here, choosing ingredients was an important compulsory lesson for a chef. Mag had told her that on the way here. "I want the brain meat of this beef, but I don't want the refined meat below," Meg said after looking for a while, pointing at a piece of the brain meat that was as fat as a snowflake. "This piece of beef is very good. If you take it back and stew it, it will make a good dish to go with wine. You really don't want it?" The butcher picked up the piece of meat and said with a smile, "The meat is good, but I don't need it." Meg shook his head with a smile. "Okay, then I'll cut it for you right away." The butcher felt that it was a pity, but he didn't say much. He neatly cut off the brain meat, weighed it, tied it with a straw rope, and handed it to Meg. Meg took the beef, paid the money, and led Phyllis to the next beef shop. Phyllis looked at the piece of meat in Meg's hand. The snowflake-like fat evenly covered the whole piece of beef, and it looked very beautiful. But when it came to meat, most people only like to eat lean meat. Why did he choose such a balanced meat? Moreover, he only wanted the part where the cow's brain was involved. Chapter 878. While explaining to Phyllis, Meg continued to stroll around the beef shops. Phyllis listened attentively. She had already gotten used to the taste and scene of the market. When she didn't understand something, She would ask a few questions and Meg would answer them one by one. After visiting 5 beef shops in a row, Meg only managed to buy 2 slices of beef ribs that were to his liking. He smiled as he said, "It's already very good that I was able to find 2 slices of beef ribs in the afternoon. It's enough for practice." "Then when is the best time to come to the market?" Phyllis asked curiously. Meg answered with a smile, "Of course it's best in the early morning, when the ingredients are the freshest. But the real experts come in the wee hours when the shop owners just start working. They can see what the whole cow looks like and what its condition is. As for the freshly slaughtered ingredients, they will immediately take them away and store them for later use. They will definitely be the best." "Young man, you are also an expert. When the market lights up in the wee hours, the people in charge of purchasing from the restaurants are already waiting outside. The cow hasn't been slaughtered yet, but someone has already ordered the parts. Good things like the kidneys can't be bought if you don't come early," the owner of the beef shop said with a smile. "You actually need to come to the market in the wee hours just for a piece of fresh ingredients." Phyllis felt a little incredulous. She looked at Meg with more and more admiration. With Meg's attitude towards food, he must be one of those people. Ingredients are the foundation of a dish. Even if a chef can use inferior ingredients to make a delicious dish, in his mind, the dish will definitely be imperfect. Meg nodded. "Then does the excellent ingredient refer to the expensive and precious ingredients?" Phyllis asked again. Meg shook his head slightly and said, "Excellent ingredients don't chase price and preciousness. It's meaningless to put a phoenix egg in the egg-fried rice made for ordinary people. For a restaurant, appropriateness is more important than preciousness. In a restaurant's positioning, finding the best ingredients at the right price is the basic ability of an excellent chef." The best ingredients at the right price. Phyllis seemed to understand something. There were many varieties of vegetables in the market. There were common vegetables such as radishes, cabbages, and green vegetables. There were also monkey head vegetables, tyrant vegetables, and other unique vegetables that were unique to this world. It was just that he couldn't think of a suitable vegetable to cook. The system sentence, even if you don't have the conditions, you have to create the conditions. It was very clear that he could only rely on himself to get first place in the vegetable rankings. The system most likely wanted to test his creativity. He couldn't bring himself to do something as shameful as wearing women's clothes and dancing Elysium Jodo in front of a restaurant. Meg had memorized all the varieties of vegetables. When he went back, he would think about the dishes that he had eaten before and see if there were any that he could cook. Without the system's help, there was still some pressure. Let's go back. If you can't make the proper sauce today, these 2 pieces of beef won't be needed. Meg bought some spices from the spice stall and then brought Phyllis back to the restaurant. "Are you sure you want to be a chef?" Meg asked Phyllis, who was putting on an apron, as he stopped at the entrance of the kitchen and looked back at Phyllis, who was putting on the apron. Phyllis paused for a moment and then nodded solemnly. "Very good. I hope you can become an excellent chef as soon as possible. That way, you can become a full-time employee in advance, and your salary will be doubled," Meg said with a smile, and then walked directly into the kitchen. When roasting beef kebabs, you have to learn how to control the heat slowly through constant practice. Before that, the most important step is to make the sauce. The sauce is the soul of the beef kebabs. Anyone can roast beef kebabs, but if you eat beef kebabs in 100 different places, there will be 100 different flavors. The difference is in the sauce. Therefore, a good sauce will determine the quality of your beef kebabs. Meg said to Phyllis as he laid out the spices that he had bought today. "Then how do I make the sauce?" Phyllis looked at Meg nervously. She didn't expect that he would start teaching her so soon. "The sauces I make have 3 flavors: spicy, soy sauce, and garlic sauce. The beef kebabs sold in the restaurant are all of these 3 flavors, and they can cover most of the customers' tastes." Meg smiled and said, "Of course, if you can make more interesting sauces in the future and get the customer's approval, you can do that. But for now, you have to learn from me how to make the sauces with these 3 flavors, and also have a deep understanding of all the spices." "Okay," Phyllis nodded. She rarely added spices to her dishes, and at most, she would add a little salt, so she didn't know much about those exotic spices. Meg put the beef kebabs in the fridge, and then explained the spices to Phyllis in an unhurried manner. Of course, the best teachers for a chef were the tongue and the nose. After chewing dozens of peppercorns, Phyllis, whose face was flushed red, had a deep understanding of what spiciness was. Meg set Phyllis's goal for lunch today was to make a soy sauce with soy sauce. After giving her a detailed explanation of the order of each spice, the amount of each spice added, and the time interval between each spice, Meg walked out of the kitchen and left the stage to Phyllis. In order to make a sauce that satisfied the system, Meg had worked tirelessly for dozens of days in the test field for the god of cookery, so he didn't have much hope that Phyllis would be able to make a sauce that satisfied him in one afternoon. Meg placed a pen and paper on the table, then poured himself a pot of tea and sat down leisurely. As expected, sitting outside was much better than standing in the kitchen. Meg quickly began to think about the vegetables he had eaten in his previous life that had left a deep impression on him. Sour and spicy shredded potatoes, braised bamboo shoots, braised cabbage with soy sauce, golden corn pancakes. One dish after another floated through Meg's mind. There were indeed many dishes that had surprised him, but he wasn't confident that they would be able to beat all the other restaurants in the Aden Square and reach the top of the vegetable rankings. Which one should I choose? Mag was still pondering and hesitating when he suddenly looked into the kitchen. His eyes widened involuntarily. In the kitchen, spices flew out of the bags and formed a line, then quickly revolved around Phyllis like a ribbon. It was very magical. A faint green light enveloped Phyllis's body, and her eyes were tightly closed, as if she were meditating. Suddenly, she opened her eyes. Spices flew out of the ribbon and landed accurately in the bowl in front of her. The soy sauce bottle floated up, and the lid opened automatically. A small amount was poured out, and more bottles and jars were opened, and all kinds of spices and condiments were added into the bowl in an orderly manner. Chapter 879. Holy shit! System, someone's cheating. Meg couldn't help but curse inwardly after being stunned for a long time. Wind elements revolved around Phyllis's body, filtering out the spices one by one before adding them into the large bowl in front of her. Regardless of whether it was the spices that revolved around her body or the spices that floated in the air after opening the lid, everything looked like a miracle. If she were my host, she would definitely be very easy to deal with. The system sighed slowly. Meg, although he didn't know how effective Phyllis was, this move of hers still stunned Meg. Moreover, he was a little envious. Sure enough, mages look more handsome than swordsmen. 5 minutes later, all the spices fell back into the spice bag, and the bottles and jars also gently returned to their original positions. Phyllis was pleasantly surprised to see the thick brown sauce in the large bowl in front of her. Wisps of fragrance were already wafting out. It didn't seem to be any different from the bowl that Meg had made before. Is it done? Meg walked into the kitchen. The mellow fragrance of the sauce assailed his nostrils. Taking a careful sniff, he could even feel the layers within the fragrance. The sauce was rich and full, with distinct layers. Judging from the fragrance alone, it could be considered a top-grade sauce. Yes, please judge. Phyllis looked nervously at Meg, her small hands already subconsciously pinching the hem of her skirt. Meg stepped forward. The brown sauce in the large white porcelain bowl looked very thick. After stirring, it left behind some swirling patterns that looked a little like a milk cap. It could be seen that the various spices and seasonings were perfectly blended together. The fragrance is passable. The shape is also passable. Meg nodded. He picked up a chopstick from the side and lightly tapped on the sauce. Then, he licked it with the tip of his tongue and closed his eyes. The sauce's fragrance spread out on the tip of his tongue, bringing an incomparably mellow texture. The soy sauce's flavor was combined with the various spices, making it even more mellow and mellow. At the same time, it also brought about a richer sense of layering. The rich fragrance released was mesmerizing, but something seemed to be missing. Meg's brows furrowed slightly. He had to admit that Phyllis was definitely a genius to be able to make such a sauce after only seeing his demonstration and the specific amount of ingredients used. After all, even after he had obtained a perfect experience bag, the first sauce he had concocted was hard for him to swallow. However, he had a strange feeling that something was missing from the sauce, which seemed to be quite good. Phyllis looked at Meg anxiously. Seeing him frown, her heart jumped to her throat. Although she didn't expect to pass on her first try, she was still a little nervous about reaching that level. Meg did not open his eyes. Instead, he licked his chopsticks again. It was so quiet in the kitchen that one could hear Phyllis's nervous breathing. Ugly Duckling looked up with a curious expression before slumping back onto the counter again. After 5 minutes of silence, Meg opened his eyes and put down his chopsticks. He looked at Phyllis and asked, "Did you use magic when you stirred the sauce?" Phyllis hurriedly replied, "Yes. Yes. I used a small pillar of wind to rotate the sauce in the bowl, allowing the spices to completely fuse together. Is there a problem?" No wonder. A smile appeared on Meg's face. He looked at the nervous Phyllis and said, "The combination of spices and seasonings is indeed perfect, but the soul of the sauce has been lost." "Has it lost its soul?" Phyllis was a little perplexed and dejected. Meg smiled at the sight of Phyllis's dejected expression. "It's already very good that you were able to do this on your first try. When I made my first concoction, it was far worse than this. The amount of spices and seasonings used and the order are all very well controlled. There are almost no flaws or mistakes." Phyllis's eyes lit up again. Meg continued, "However, a good dish has a soul. Precision is only the foundation. Some steps are not just for the sake of getting results. Only by using your hands to feel the changes in the dish can you inject soul into the dish." "So, should I give up on magic and use my hands to cook?" Phyllis asked thoughtfully. "No. Your talent and advantage as a magician will allow you to precisely control your cooking. This is an ability that many chefs dream of. How can you give it up?" Meg shook his head with a smile. He pointed at the sauce in front of him and said, "There is only one area that you need to improve. You need to change the steps of stirring the pillar of wind to manual stirring. Use your hands to feel the changes in the sauce, and use your heart to feel the critical point of fusion. When you find that critical point, the sauce will be perfect. Although the pillar of wind is good, perfect fusion doesn't mean that the sauce will be perfect. Only the hands of a chef can feel the degree of fusion." Critical point degree. Phyllis pondered for a moment, and her eyes lit up. She suddenly understood where the harmonious feeling she had when watching Meg cook came from. It was the fusion. The fusion between the chef, the pot, and the dish in the pot was a miraculous 0 point. What she was best at was control. She had precise control over the ingredients and seasonings, and she pursued the ultimate perfection of the cooking process. However, she had lost the silent joy and rhythm in the process. Meg's words were like a beam of light that helped her find her direction. Being strict was the attitude of a chef, but the heart that a chef put into a dish was the soul of the dish. Meg looked into Phyllis's eyes and smiled. "Try again." Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen. "It's not uniform enough." "No. It's clear on the top and rich on the bottom." "No. No." Meg sat at the table and carefully tasted the sauce that Phyllis had brought over. Then he gave a brief evaluation. Although Phyllis kept being rejected, she was not anxious. Soon, she returned to the kitchen to mix the sauce again. Time flew by quickly, and Mag took a look at the clock on the wall. It was time to prepare for the evening service again. Just as he was about to rise to his feet, Phyllis walked out with a bowl of sauce in her hands. She placed it gently in front of Mag with a calm expression, but the anticipation in her eyes was unmistakable. Meg looked at the sauce. The thick brown sauce had a uniform color, and a rich sauce aroma wafted out. He picked up his chopsticks and touched the sauce. Then he licked it with the tip of his tongue. This taste. Meg's eyes lit up. The full and round sauce blossomed on the tip of his tongue, bringing an incomparably mellow taste. All kinds of spices and seasonings blended perfectly. There was a distinct sense of layering, and the aftertaste was endless. "This time, is it also a failure?" Phyllis asked nervously. Chapter 880. Phyllis blushed slightly under Meg's intense gaze, but the joy in her heart was even more difficult to suppress. She had spent the entire afternoon trying to feel and find that critical point. She had failed again and again, and then she had gained a deeper understanding of the characteristics of the spices. Finally, she had found the so-called critical point. It was a very special feeling, a point in her heart. At that moment, a voice suddenly sounded in her heart, telling her that she could do it, and then she stopped. You've already mastered the sauce. I'll teach you the other two sauces next time. Now, I'll teach you how to roast kebabs. Meg stood up and walked towards the kitchen. Phyllis quickly stopped smiling and followed him into the kitchen. Roasting kebabs was a skill. The control of the fire, the skill of turning the kebabs, the timing of applying the sauce, how to judge whether the kebabs were roasted just right. These skills could not be mastered by timing. It was a great test of the chef's eyesight and experience. Phyllis learned the steps of cutting the beef into small cubes and skewering it effortlessly. With the help of magic, her efficiency was much higher than Meg's. In order to train her, Meg had her prepare all the beef for tonight's roast kebabs and also had her cut several large pots of ingredients. He called it training knife skills. This is like cutting a concubine. Meg couldn't help but sigh as he looked at the ingredients falling into the large pots. The cut was smooth, and the size was exactly the same. Then he looked at Phyllis, who was surrounded by cyan wind blades, and couldn't help but sigh. Meg originally needed 2 hours to prepare the ingredients, but Phyllis finished them all in half an hour. Then, Meg began to teach Phyllis how to roast beef kebabs with satisfaction. Meg's teaching was very detailed. Whether it was the advantages of roasting kebabs, the temperature range of the grill, or how to judge the next step based on the color and change of the beef, he gave a detailed explanation of everything. Although he explained in detail, Meg knew that for a novice like him, it was definitely hell level of difficulty, not to mention roasting perfect kebabs to his satisfaction. Back then, in order to roast skewers to the satisfaction of the system, he had spent dozens of sleepless days practicing, and this was under the premise that he had obtained a perfect experience. Of course, he had the patience to wait for Phyllis. It was not easy to train a chef. He had already picked up a genius with a solid foundation and outstanding talent. Phyllis listened attentively the entire time. But just by listening, she understood that the roasting process was on a completely different level of difficulty compared to the mixing of the sauce. I've already told you all the steps. When you can make a kebab that looks exactly like this, you'll have succeeded. Meg handed one of the 2 kebabs to Phyllis while he walked out of the kitchen with the other in his mouth. Since Phyllis had relieved him of most of the burden, he could rest for another hour. Phyllis looked at the kebab in her hand. The rich aroma of the sauce and beef wafted into her nose. This was the sauce that she had just mixed, and the beef was also the one that they had bought together at the market. The translucent fatty meat was embedded in the beef like small crystals. The sauce was very smooth and evenly applied, and the surface of the meat glistened with a faint, oily sheen. It looked very delicate. After hesitating for a moment, Phyllis opened her small mouth and bit off a piece of beef. Her white teeth bit into the beef, and her thin eyebrows immediately raised. The rich fragrance of the sauce and the gravy flowing in the beef instantly awakened her taste buds. With a light chew, the gravy splashed in her mouth, colliding with the sauce and condiments to create an inconceivably delicious taste. It was as if a thunderbolt fireball had exploded in her mouth and then turned into countless thunderbolt fireballs. The taste had completely exploded. The more Phyllis chewed, the more the aroma exploded. She couldn't help but chew faster and faster, and it became an interesting cycle that she couldn't stop. Even after swallowing the meat, the unforgettable aroma of the sauce still lingered in her mouth. Eating the kebab this time was a little different from eating it at noon. Not only was it delicious, but Phyllis could also feel the wisdom contained in the seemingly ordinary sauce. The tender texture of the beef depended on the proficiency of Meg's roasting skills, and the unique sauce displayed Meg's wisdom incisively and vividly. The kebab was quickly devoured by Phyllis. She licked the sauce off her finger, and her eyes were filled with fighting spirit. She took a glance at Meg, who was writing on a piece of paper in the kitchen, and took a deep breath before picking up a kebab. How about making eggplant with garlic sauce? After crossing out countless names on the paper, Meg's eyes suddenly lit up. He scribbled a few words on the paper and circled them. Eggplant with garlic sauce was one of Meg's favorites. In addition, There was also grilled eggplant, which was a must-have for barbecue food stalls. Both were delicacies that could bring happiness. Meg had eaten eggplant with garlic sauce in a small restaurant in Sichuan years ago, and it left a deep impression on him. Regardless of whether it was authentic or not, he had never eaten eggplant with garlic sauce more delicious than this one since then. He had even made a special trip there, but the community had been demolished, and the tiny restaurant was nowhere to be found. However, because of the delicious taste, Meg had asked the owner of the restaurant how to make eggplant with garlic sauce. The owner was magnanimous and simply told him how to make it. After thinking about it carefully, Meg still remembered the ingredients and steps. However, to make a delicious dish, it was not enough to only know the ingredients and steps. The amount of seasoning, the control of the fire, and most importantly, the method of making bean paste. The most important ingredient of eggplant with garlic sauce was bean paste. This kind of seasoning was placed on the stove of every household in Sichuan. It was one of the most important seasonings in Sichuan cuisine. In the eyes of many Sichuan people, it seemed that a dish would not be perfect without a spoonful of bean paste. When the oil was heated and a spoonful of bean paste was added into the wok, the fragrance immediately overflowed. The stir-fried dish had a rich and lingering aftertaste. Whether it was eggplant with garlic sauce, twice-cooked pork with green pepper, or fatty dompa pig knuckle, a spoonful of bean paste was indispensable. Making bean paste was also a necessary skill for mothers. As a stay-at-home dad, Meg had not mastered this skill. However, as a Sichuan cuisine enthusiast, he had dissed many Sichuan restaurants. In order to make himself appear more professional, he had some basic knowledge of bean paste. He had been to Pai County a few times and watched the restaurant owner make bean paste, but he did not ask for the recipe. Now he only remembered some ingredients and steps. Chapter 881. It was almost time for dinner. Meg had decided on a recipe for eggplant with garlic sauce, but he still needed to experiment with the exact amount of ingredients and condiments. Without the experience of a master chef and a precise recipe, it was undoubtedly a new challenge for Meg. Not only did he have to be patient, but he also had to apply his understanding of cooking in a comprehensive way to make eggplant with garlic sauce to his satisfaction. Putting away his pen and paper, Meg walked to the kitchen door. Phyllis hadn't brought out the kebabs for him to try yet, so he was curious about her progress. "It seems that my amazing talent didn't come into play when it came to kebabs," Meg said with a smile as he stood at the door and looked at Phyllis, who was standing nervously in front of the grill. Her forehead was dotted with tiny beads of sweat, and she stared intently at the kebab on the grill. Her hands were a little stiff, and it was as if she were holding something that could explode at any moment. On the plate beside her hand, there was a small mountain of failed products. Some of them were as black as charcoal. Some of them even had their bamboo skewers burnt off, and some of them were half-cooked. None of them could be seen, let alone eaten. Meg glanced at the burnt kebabs in Phyllis's hands and walked into the kitchen. Looking at the disheartened Phyllis, he said with a smile, "You're as good as I was when I first started." Phyllis, who had been disheartened, turned around and looked at Meg in disbelief. "Were you like this when you first started?" "I'm not a genius chef. I'm just a little luckier and more hard-working than others." Meg nodded with a smile and said in his heart, "Of course, the first point is more important." Confidence reappeared in Phyllis's eyes. Meg threw the kebabs that Phyllis had failed to make into the kitchen waste bin, tidied up the stove, and said with a smile, "That's all for today's practice. When you start work the day after tomorrow, you'll be responsible for preparing all the ingredients that need to be used with knives. You can practice in the restaurant. If you have something to do tonight, you can leave after dinner. If you have nothing to do, you can also stay in the restaurant. If it's possible, I'd like to see you cook." Phyllis looked at Meg with bright eyes. Before this, the only person she admired in her heart was the princess, but now there was one more. "It's up to you. I'll arrange a place for you tonight." Meg nodded slightly. It was a good thing that Phyllis was eager to learn. He hoped more than anyone else that she could grow into a chef who could take charge of her own business as soon as possible, so that he could be liberated slowly. As for the accommodation, Meg had already thought of expanding the dormitory that Mia and the others were currently living in into a 4-bedroom dormitory. Anyway, there was still a large empty space next to it. When he built the dormitory for Mia and the others, he had asked the system to reserve 2 spaces. After the rooms were built, he could just open the door and it would not affect the layout at all. By the way, what style do you like in your room? Meg suddenly looked up at Phyllis, who was tidying up the room, and asked. Huh. Phyllis was a little confused. Well, I'm going to arrange a dormitory for you. What kind of decoration or color do you like? Meg explained. After what happened last time, he had decided not to guess what a woman was thinking. Phyllis's heart warmed. Except for Her Highness. No one had ever asked her what she wanted, and no one had ever considered what she liked. Meg not only taught her how to cook, but he had also been so considerate of her. Looking at the gentle smile on his face, Phyllis's heart thumped loudly, and she said softly, I like something simple. It doesn't need to be too luxurious, just something simple. After saying that, Phyllis stole a glance at Meg again, and said somewhat worriedly, This way, aren't my requirements too high? Isn't this the same as not having any requirements? Meg smiled and shook his head. The little girl was still too shy, but if she wanted to be simple and elegant, it would be easy. It seemed that she still retained many of the instincts of an elf. System. Meg and the system haggled for a while, and finally added a dormitory for Phyllis at the price of 30,000 coins, as well as the packaging and all the furniture. Father, the children are going to have a parent-teacher conference. Do you want to go? Amy asked as soon as she came home from school. A parent-teacher conference? Meg looked at Amy, who was carrying a small backpack, with surprise. Crassus and Julian came to the restaurant every day to eat, which meant that they came to visit every day. Furthermore, Amy was their only student. Did they have to have a parent-teacher conference? Yes. When Daphne came to play with me after school, she told me that all the children's parents will be there. You'll be there too, right? Amy nodded her little head and looked at Meg with her big blue eyes full of anticipation. So it's a unified student conference for the students of Chaos School. Meg understood, but he was a little anxious when he saw Amy's expectant gaze. Amy was studying magic with Crassus and Julian every day. She didn't have any followers at Chaos School, and Crassus hadn't notified her at all. But looking at Amy's expectant gaze, Meg couldn't bear to turn her down. He smiled and stroked Amy's head and said, It's Amy's first parent-teacher conference. Of course I'll be there. That's great. Amy jumped up happily. She hugged Meg's arm and swung it from side to side. Father, you're the best. Phyllis stood at the kitchen door and looked at this scene with a smile on her face. This father and daughter were so loving at all times. It was enviable and heartwarming. But Daphne said that both father and mother have to be present at this parent-teacher conference. Amy's voice trailed off as she looked at Meg carefully. In that case, Meg also pondered. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. Why don't we find someone to replace them? Both of them turned to look at Phyllis with contemplative looks on their faces. Phyllis, who had been a little worried, was stunned. Her heart started to pound like a little deer. Although she had promised to help Boss take care of the child before coming, she didn't have to pretend to be the child's mother. Did she? But looking at the delicate and adorable Amy and the mature and gentle Meg, Phyllis's heart softened again. It's not easy for a man to take care of a child by himself. If mother doesn't go to the parent-teacher conference, she'll definitely be criticized, right? In that case, I'll reluctantly agree. I don't think so. Big Sister Bean Sprout is too small. Amy shook her head. Yes, and she's too young. She still looks like a child. Meg nodded in agreement. Chapter 882. It was snowing all year round on the ice-blue Frost Island. White frost dragons could be seen gliding across the sky from time to time. The palaces that stood in this world of ice and snow were all very grand. They were like icicles standing tall. In a grand palace, a few figures were sitting in the main seats. Fox was sitting in the main seat, and the other 5 were old men with white hair and beards. An old man sitting in the front seat looked at Fox and said in a low voice, Fox, if you want to become the chief, you have to prove that Rankster is dead. Otherwise, Douglas won't agree so easily. Another old man nodded. Yes, Rankster was severely injured in the battle with Alex. 3 years ago, he disappeared with Alex almost at the same time. In the past 3 years, the frost dragons have searched the entire continent, but they couldn't find any trace of him. They only found a few of his belongings, but didn't find his body. Fox's expression was a little ferocious. His life fire was extinguished 2 years ago. According to the teachings of the dragons, the extinguishing of life fire means death. Why does Douglas still refuse to admit that Rankster is dead? Could it be that he was beaten silly by Rankster back then? Although his life fire in our Frost Dragon tribe has extinguished, his life fire in the Golden Dragon tribe is still lit. Although it's extremely weak, this alone proves that he's still alive. At least his soul hasn't dissipated. Rankster is very good at living. This has been proven time and again since he was born, an old man said calmly. The palace fell silent. Although they didn't want to admit it, this was a saying that had been passed down on Dragon Island for the past 1,000 years. No one could refute it. Although Rankster was born in the noble Frost Dragon tribe, his mother was from the Golden Dragon tribe. Back then, the Golden Dragons and Frost Dragons fought each other, and countless people died. The hatred was unresolvable. Rankster, who was still in the womb, was sentenced to death. However, after he was born, his mother risked her life to send him to the Frost Dragon tribe. Douglas, the chief of the Frost Dragon tribe, threw Rankster, who he had just received, off the Frost Island and continued the war with the Golden Dragons. 20 years later, Rankster, who everyone thought was dead, appeared on Dragon Island again and began his legendary life. He defeated countless powerhouses of the Golden Dragon and Frost Dragon tribes on his own. Stepping on mountains of corpses and seas of blood, he forced Douglas, who had thrown him off Dragon Island, to abdicate and become the chief of the Frost Dragon tribe, ending the war between the two tribes that lasted for almost 1,000 years. To come to the Frost Dragon to come back to life. But every time, to come back to life to come back. Back then, Rankster's power was already among the top 3 on Dragon Island, and he had an unshakable position. However, it was this unstoppable Rankster who met Alex, who was also at his peak 10 years ago. Alex won. He was also seriously injured. Then, he began his journey to slay dragons. No one knew how serious Rankster's injuries were. But before this, he had never gone into seclusion because of his injuries. Moreover, he had gone into seclusion for 7 years. 3 years ago, the news of Alex being killed in Rodu reached Dragon Island. Rankster came out of seclusion and disappeared. His whereabouts were unknown. Some said that he didn't believe that Alex was dead and went to look for him. Some said that he had lost interest in life and committed suicide because he had lost the opponent he wanted to defeat the most in his life. But one thing was for sure. From then on, the flamboyant Frost Dragon chief had completely disappeared. Without a leader, the Frost Dragon tribe naturally discussed the matter of electing a new chief. Douglas, who had been forced to retreat by Rankster, was expected to be the chief. But no one expected him to reject this. He even instructed them to put this matter aside and look for Rankster. He also said that even if they couldn't find Rankster, the position of chief had to be handed over to the younger dragons so that the younger ones could lead the Frost Dragons forward. There was still no news from Rankster, but the second half of the sentence made many of the Frost Dragon tribe's members think about it. Among the younger generation, Fox was Rankster's half-brother. They were very close, and he was a 9th-tier powerhouse. Although he was far from Rankster, he was undoubtedly the most powerful person in his generation. There was also Rankster's only daughter, Elizabeth, who was the center of attention. Elizabeth had the pure Frost Dragon bloodline and inherited Rankster's powerful talent. She had already broken through to the 7th tier before she reached adulthood. She had hopes of breaking through to the 10th tier before she was 100 years old. With the lifespan of the dragon tribe of thousands of years, such talent was enough to be called a rare genius. However, because Rankster's way of getting the position was too tragic, and he had the bloodline of both the Frost Dragon and the Golden Dragon tribe, not many people chose to support Elizabeth after losing his powerful deterrents. But because Douglas had protected Elizabeth several times, many people chose to wait and see. They didn't choose a side easily. The Golden Colossal Dragons were even more forceful in expressing their support for Elizabeth's ascension to the throne. The throne was so close, but he could only watch helplessly. How could Fox be satisfied? If it wasn't for Rankster's posthumous son, he would have been the chief of the Frost Dragon tribe long ago. Fox clenched his fists and said, since Alex is not dead, if Rankster is not dead, he should be coming out now, right? With his personality, he will definitely challenge Alex to a duel again, right? If he is killed by Alex, then I will be the chief, right? If Elizabeth is also dead, you will be the chief. A cold voice sounded from the corner. Big Sister Mia has horns on her head, but I don't, so I definitely can't. Big Sister Barbara also looks very young, and she is really very young. She is indeed very young, so she definitely can't. At the dining table, Amy and Meg ignored Barbara, who was blushing because of the three little girls. Their gazes landed on Sally at the same time. If that's the case, Big Sister Aisha seems to be the most suitable. She is a mature and beautiful elf. Amy looked at Sally and nodded with satisfaction. Then, she looked at Meg with a smile and said, of course, if Father doesn't mind, I think Big Brother Blower would look good in female clothes too. I refuse. Chapter 883. Have you tried Mr. Mac's new dish? That stinky tofu that's said to be extremely smelly? I don't dare to try it. Yeah, it stinks. You better not try it. After all, there are only 100 servings a day. Outside Mamie's, the discussion about stinky tofu was more heated than the tofu pudding, which was rare. Carla, why did you bring me here so mysteriously today? Don't tell me you want me to try that stinky tofu? In the group, a woman in a purple gold uniform looked suspiciously at the woman in pink standing in front of her. Although Chris was only 23 years old, she was now the manager of a branch of Buffett Banks. She had entered the bank at the age of 18, and with her outstanding performance, she had been promoted again and again. She was also a little famous in the Buffett family. Carla was her best friend. Her family owned more than a dozen mines in the Goblins' territory. They had become close friends because of their work. Carla loved good food, so she often took Chris to all kinds of restaurants or eat strange things. Chris felt a little helpless, but as long as she was free, she would accompany Carla to eat. However, she had a bottom line. She would never eat food that was dirty or had a strange taste. Besides, the customers she served were all upper-class people, so she cared more about her image. After all, it was related to her professionalism. She was going to attend a banquet tonight. She had been preparing for a big deal for a long time, and whether it would succeed or not depended on tonight. Therefore, she refused to eat anything with a strange smell. She had heard about this restaurant many times from Carla, but she had missed it the last few times because she was busy. Tonight's banquet would start late, but she couldn't resist Carla's coaxing and pestering, so she came with her. She planned to go back after eating something and change into a formal dress to attend the banquet. Of course not. When did I recommend you to eat stinky food? The owner of this restaurant is really something. He went to Rodu to cook for the king of the Roth Empire and won the best dish at the palace banquet. You haven't had the chance to try it before, so you have to try it this time. Carla looked serious. Then she whispered in Chris's ear, besides, the owner is super handsome. He should be your type. You're so talkative. Chris smiled and patted Carla's head. She was curious about the boss who won the best award at the palace banquet. Not being able to eat to your heart's content is really torturous. However, what the doctor said today is similar to what Mr. Max said. In order to live a few more years and eat a few more years of good food, it's better to restrain yourself a little. Abraham, who was in front of Chris and the others in the line, sighed and looked a little lost. Welcome. The bell on the door rang, and the door of the restaurant opened. Meg stood at the door, looking at everyone with a smile. This person. Chris's eyes slightly brightened. The clothes-fitting black and white chef's uniform made his tall figure seem even more upright. He was different from the greasy appearance of ordinary chefs. Not even the slightest trace of oil could be seen on his apron. His white skin was also very natural. The two tufts of mustache on his upper lip made his handsome face look much more mature and steady. His black eyes were clear and bright. What do you think? Is he the young man you like? Although he has a little daughter, she is also super cute. I feel that if you marry him and get a little angel, you'll make a lot of money. Carla said with a smile. Daughter. Chris was a little surprised. Amy came out from behind Meg and said seriously, Everyone, please follow the order when you eat. Remember to pay. Otherwise, Amy will be angry. If Amy is angry, the consequences will be very serious. The cute little fairy, who was like an ice sculpture, was saying harsh words. The customers in the line at the entrance of the restaurant all showed kind smiles on their faces. Little Boss is deliberately acting cute. She's so cute. Every time you feel depressed, come to Amy's to eat something delicious. Look at Little Boss for a while, and your mood will always be better. Is this the boss's daughter? She looks so cute, and the way she talks is so cute. Just for this, I have to eat here tonight. If only I could marry Mr. Mac. I would have a handsome husband who can cook and a cute and strong daughter. I would be a winner in life. The crowd was in an uproar. She's so cute. Chris looked at Amy, who was standing beside Meg, and felt like her heart had been hit. She was usually busy with work, so she had no feelings for children. She even thought that if she had children, they would be a burden. But now, looking at Amy, she couldn't help but think that she would be very happy to have such a cute daughter. I heard that Amy's doesn't have a lady boss. Do you want to try? This is the man that all the girls in Chaos City have their eyes on. I'll let you have him. If you become the owner's wife in the future, I don't need you to give me a free meal. Just buy me one more serving of tofu pudding every day. It's the best product for beauty. Carla said, egging her on. Chris touched Carla's head helplessly. You're not sick. Why are you fantasizing? If you let me have him, there are thousands of foodie girls out there. Besides, I don't want to be the lady boss now. My career is the most important thing. Okay. I know you put your career first. Carla removed Chris's hand from her forehead and smiled slyly. But I think you won't think, so after you try Mr. Mac's food. Please come in. Meg smiled and touched Amy's head. Now, Amy was the restaurant security manager. She would deter and punish customers who tried to cheat, dine, and dash, or deliberately provoke the restaurant's order. The effect was surprisingly good. Meg and Amy stood aside and let them through the door. The customers entered the restaurant one by one. They greeted Meg and Amy with familiarity. Meg responded to them with a smile. Mr. Mac is so handsome today. Carla walked to the door and smiled sweetly at Meg. Father is handsome every day, so he won't give you an extra serving of tofu pudding, Amy said with a smile before Meg could say anything. Carla. Chapter 884. Thank you, Carla said as she walked into the restaurant. A hint of surprise appeared on Christie's face. It was very rare for her to see Carla being rejected. In other restaurants, she would be treated like a VIP. But here, she couldn't even get an extra helping of tofu pudding. She nodded politely at Mag, and then couldn't help but take a glance at Amy before entering the restaurant. Mag's gaze also paused on Christie for a moment. She was a beauty that made people want to take a second look at her. Her light blonde hair was tied up in a neat yet elegant manner. Her purple gold uniform was similar to the office lady's uniform in the modern workplace. Her light brown eyes were confident and approachable. Mag also recognized the badge pinned to her chest. In fact, there were very few people in Chaos City who didn't recognize it. It should be one of the middle managers of Buffett Banks, right? Meg glanced at the information that popped out of the omniscient door. Christie, female, 23 years old. Her body functions are generally healthy. There is a small area of inflammation in her stomach that is showing signs of spreading. Young people tend to forget to eat when they are busy with work. Mag shook his head. To be able to climb to the management level at such a young age, unless she was bed climbing, she wouldn't have been able to do it without some effort. Of course, Meg didn't think anyone could climb to a bed on the hill, so this beautiful girl must be very capable. Meg walked to the kitchen with a smile. From today onwards, we will only serve 100 stinky tofu at night. Because the quantity is limited, each person is limited to one serving. Customers who want to order stinky tofu, please sit in this row, Yabamiya said loudly with a smile. 100 servings. A limited order. Mr. Mac, you are so cruel. This is even crueler than tofu pudding. The customers who had tasted the stinky tofu yesterday were all crying out. There were too many wolves and too little meat. It seemed that they would have to rely on their luck to eat the stinky tofu in the future. Let's sit here, Christy. Carla pulled Christy to a seat near the wall. You want to eat that stinky tofu? Chris suddenly stopped in her tracks. Carla said with a serious face, I promise that it's really a rumor. If you taste it yourself, you will definitely fall in love with the taste. It's addictive. But it stinks. Chris still shook her head. If you really don't want to eat, Carla rolled her eyes and whispered in Chris's ear, then you can order one more for me. I'll eat it all. Now we can only order one. Please. Chris knew that Carla loved good food. Her heart softened, and she nodded. I really don't want to eat. I have to attend a banquet tonight, so I can only eat a little bit. Carla nodded. I'm sorry. I have to attend a banquet tonight, so I can only eat a little. I know. I'll recommend you some food later. You definitely won't be full. A smile appeared on Carla's face. However, in Amy's, there are only two options: finish eating or not eating. I have never seen anyone who only eats a little. Then you will see it today, Chris said. Carla and Chris sat down across from Abraham and Harrison, nodding slightly as a greeting. When they entered the restaurant, Chris had already looked around. Even a picky person like her had to admit that this was the cleanest restaurant she had ever seen. The tables, chairs, floor, ceiling, and even the corners blocked by flower pots were all spotless. The air was very fresh, and she could smell a faint hint of mint. It was very light, but it made the air more refreshing. It was just that she was not used to sharing a table with strangers. However, seeing that Carla did not mind at all, and the guests in the restaurant were sitting casually, even elves and demons sitting at the same table, Carla felt that it was strange, so she did not say anything. Out of professional habit, she quietly looked at the two people sitting across from her. The fat young man on the left was wearing a luxurious robe with a thick gold chain around his neck. He seemed to be from a well-off family, but he did not have much of a background. He belonged to the emerging middle class. She then looked at the one on the right. He was about 40 years old and wore a soft gray silk robe. Chris's gaze stopped on the jade ring on his right thumb. She was slightly surprised. That was the best quality Philas jadeite produced in the Philas mountain range mine on the main island of Dragon Island. At first glance, it looked no different from ordinary jadeite, but within the green jadeite, there were strands of golden threads as thin as hair. Such a small piece of jadeite could dispel the cold and dissipate heat, allowing the body to maintain a comfortable temperature. Philas jade was produced in very small quantities and rarely left Dragon Island. It was a precious collection of giant dragons. It was priceless on the Norland continent. Every time it appeared, it would be sold at a sky-high price. And the man in front of her actually had such a piece of jade. If he wasn't an extremely wealthy person, then he must be a person with an extremely high position. I don't know this man among the rich in Chaos City, and he's not from the City Lord's castle or the Great Temple. I heard that Duke Abraham of the Roth Empire came to Chaos City 2 days ago and exchanged some gold coins from the bank. Could it be? Chris guessed the man's identity, and the surprise in her eyes deepened. Duke Abraham was such a noble that even the city lord had to treat him as an honored guest. How could he be sharing a table with someone in this restaurant? While Chris was in a daze, Abraham looked around and leaned forward. He whispered, "Little girl, do you want to eat stinky tofu too? Can't we discuss something? I'll buy your stinky tofu at 5 times the price." Huh. Chris was taken aback. She looked at Abraham's serious face with mixed feelings. How could a duke like him buy more stinky tofu from them so carefully? What's wrong with this world? Is stinky tofu really that good? Uncle, I'll pay you 10 times the price. Can you sell your stinky tofu to me? Carla also leaned forward and lowered her voice. Abraham, I didn't expect you to be my kindred spirit. Goodbye. The two looked at each other and stood up at the same time. What would you like to order? Yabamiya walked over and asked with a smile. I'd like a braised chicken and rice, a sweet tofu pudding, and a stinky tofu, Abraham said, closing the menu. I'd like a Yangzhou fried rice, 10 beef kebabs, half spicy and half spicy, and a savory tofu pudding and a stinky tofu, Carla said without even opening the menu. Chris opened the menu and looked at the pictures of all kinds of food. Every one of them looked so tempting. She hesitated. Chapter 885. Isn't that too much? Chris hesitated. You should think about what I ordered before you ask, Carla said with a smile. Chris thought about the list of dishes Carla had just ordered and smiled. She closed the menu and looked at Mia. Then I'll order these 3. Okay, please wait a moment. Mia nodded and walked to the next table. One order after another was placed in the kitchen. Meg began to get busy. Phyllis stood in the corner and watched with rapt attention. Meg's cooking ideas and cooking methods were completely different from hers. She was amazed by the variety of kitchen utensils he used. Watching him cook was like watching a show. The ingredients were rolling and jumping in the pot. The flames were raging in the pot, and all kinds of delicious smells filled the kitchen. It was almost suffocating. Dishes were brought out of the small kitchen and placed on the tables of the guests. Praises and compliments came from the bottom of the heart. Phyllis looked at Meg with admiration. Your Yangzhou fried rice and your black pepper steak. Enjoy. Mia put the fried rice and steak in front of Carla and Chris, respectively, and walked to the next customer with a smile. The aroma of the red wine and the steak wafted into Chris's nose. There was also a hint of a special aroma. The alluring and special aroma made Chris's eyes light up. As the manager of a branch of Buffett Banks, Chris was no stranger to high-end restaurants. It was often easier to do business at the table. But even though she had eaten in all the high-end restaurants in Chaos City, she was still amazed by the aroma of this so-called black pepper steak. A whole piece of steak was placed on the plate. The steak had beautiful lines on it, and the thick sauce was drizzled over it. It was still emitting hot steam. Red and green peppers and vegetables were scattered around the steak. The exquisite presentation made the steak look even more tempting. Try it. You'll be surprised. Carla had already scooped up a spoonful of Yangzhou fried rice and put it in her mouth with a happy smile. I have to wear formal attire for tonight's banquet. I can only eat a few mouthfuls, Chris said with a smile. She also picked up a knife and fork. The knife cut through the tender beef. Red meat juice and red wine flowed out, and the aroma of red wine in the air became stronger. After the brown steak was cut, the center was pink. There was no blood, but a beautiful pink. She put it in her mouth with a fork. The beef was more tender than she had imagined. When she bit into it, the juices of the meat and red wine flowed out, and then mixed with the black pepper sauce in her mouth. It was like a magician's magic explosion in her mouth, and her calm taste buds were in ecstasy. After carefully chewing, Chris's expression changed in a split second. Apart from the delicious taste of the beef, the sweet taste of the wine was like a hidden treasure that suddenly appeared in front of her. It was an irresistible attack of sweetness. It was not overshadowed by the deliciousness of the beef and black pepper, nor did it appear to be abrupt or unique. Instead, it blended perfectly into the beef, making the beef even more delicious and mellow, giving it a mellow texture. The rich layers of flavor made her feel like she was constantly spinning in a delicious roulette. Every second was a wonderful and special experience. After swallowing, she felt as if a ball of warmth slid down her throat, warming her stomach. It was so comfortable that she wanted to moan. Chris's red lips opened slightly. In the end, she couldn't help but let out a soft moan. The mellow aroma of the red wine still lingered in her mouth, intoxicating her, but the taste buds on the tip of her tongue were already yearning for the next intimate contact. Chris opened her eyes, her face slightly red. She had never lost her composure in front of anyone before. It was just that the delicious taste of the black pepper steak was too impactful. Her body's natural reaction was beyond her control. However, her shyness was quickly overshadowed by her desire for good food. Chris had already cut off the second piece of steak and put it into her mouth. She closed her eyes and carefully tasted the delicious taste on the tip of her tongue. The mellow wine was better than the so-called countless treasures of the rich merchants. But why would someone use this kind of wine to cook? That owner was really an interesting person. As for what she said before about only having 2 bites, she had completely forgotten about it. How could she say something like that to such delicious food? Carla looked at Chris, who was eating one bite after another, and a satisfied smile appeared on her face. I told you, there are only two kinds of people at Mamie's. Those who don't eat and those who finish their food. There's no such thing as two bites. Even the braised chicken and rice is so delicious. Mr. Mac never disappoints. Looks like we can't go back to Rodu. Abraham ate the braised chicken and rice in big mouthfuls, his face full of enjoyment. Ding! The knife and fork clanged on the plate. Chris looked at the completely empty plate in front of her and was slightly stunned. Then, she licked the sauce off the corner of her mouth, as if she hadn't had enough yet. Why did I finish it all? A strong sense of guilt welled up in Chris's heart. Looking at her slightly swollen belly, she almost couldn't resist the urge to eat more. No, I can't eat any more. Chris shook her head and said with determination, This is just the beginning. Carla put down her spoon and said with a smile, Here's your savory tofu pudding. 2 servings of tofu pudding were placed in front of them. The refreshing aroma of tofu pudding drifted over, and Chris, who had already made up her mind, couldn't help but look down. The orange sauce was poured over the white tofu pudding, and the pickled mustard was chopped. Then coriander, garlic, and chopped green onions were sprinkled on top. The hot tofu pudding was still mixed with the savory aroma. She was a little surprised. What is this? Carla smiled and said, Didn't you say you didn't rest well these days, and that you have small pimples on your face? Eat this tofu pudding, and you'll be fine tomorrow. Really? Chris was a little surprised. Carla had mentioned the tofu pudding to her many times, and her skin had indeed improved a lot during this time. However, she didn't believe that it was because of a certain food. The branch hadn't reached its target this month, and because of anxiety and insomnia, there were a few pink pimples on her forehead and chin. Although they weren't very obvious, they were undoubtedly a disaster for a girl. She had tried many ways to get rid of them, but they still didn't go away. In her anxiety, they grew even more. Now, Carla said that the tofu pudding could cure all the pimples. She was pleasantly surprised, but also a little skeptical. I brought you here to eat this today. Are you sure you don't want to try it? Carla said with a serious face. Chapter 886. The tofu pudding slid down her tongue and melted. The light flavor of the tofu pudding and the savory sauce melted in her mouth. The few simple side dishes served as the finishing touch. Paired with the sweet and fragrant tofu pudding, the taste was so refreshing and delicious. After swallowing, the faint bean flavor lingered in the mouth for a long time. It was fragrant but not greasy. Chris's eyebrows relaxed, and a smile appeared on her face. She had just eaten a black pepper steak, and this savory tofu pudding was refreshing. Her whole body felt refreshed. Unlike the impactful steak, the tofu pudding was softer. It was like a steady stream, bringing unparalleled happiness. When Chris put down the spoon, the bowl was already empty. I only ate 2 mouthfuls. Why is it gone? This is so good. Chris looked at the empty bowl in front of her, a little upset. How is it? Isn't it super good? Carla asked with a smile. Yes, it's the most delicious of all the delicacies you brought me to. Chris nodded. It should be said that it was the most delicious of all the food she had ever eaten. But I ate too much. I have to prepare a new dress later. Chris touched her belly helplessly. It's okay. You won't be able to eat anything better than this at the banquet. Carla smiled slyly. That's true. Chris paused for a moment, then nodded in agreement. Your stinky tofu. At this time, Mia walked to the table with a large tray. She placed 4 covered plates in front of everyone. Okay, here comes the highlight. Carla's eyes lit up. She rubbed her hands and looked at Chris. You really don't want to try it? I think this is something you will regret if you miss it. Chris shook her head. I have to meet an important client later. I can't eat anything too strong. Besides, if I eat more, I won't have any clothes to wear. Okay, then I won't force you. But you better be prepared. This taste is a little too strong. Carla didn't force her. Instead, she warned her. Then Mia lifted the lids in front of everyone one by one. The thick stench was like 4 volcanoes erupting at the same time, instantly filling the entire space. Oh! Christy and the expectant Abraham jumped up from their chairs at almost the same time. Phyllis's face was flushed red, and she couldn't help but take 2 steps back. Only after the air had cleared did she catch her breath. She looked at the black, stinky tofu on the table with lingering fear. It was a stench that she could not describe. It was so strong that she almost suffocated. However, the moment she left the area around the table, the stench disappeared completely. It was as if an invisible wall had trapped her within the area around the table. Thinking back, it did not make her feel disgusted. It was a little strange, but even so, Chris had no intention of sitting back down. The stench was real, and she couldn't accept it at all. She didn't want to smell it again for the rest of her life, let alone eat it. Carla, how did she manage to withstand the stench? And she looks like she's enjoying it. Chris looked strangely at Carla and Harrison, who were still sitting at the table. Not only did the two not react to the strong stench, but they also seemed to be enjoying it, as if they were enjoying something delicious. No! Hold it! Abraham, who also stood up abruptly, resisted the urge to run away. He didn't expect the stench to be so strong. Although he was mentally prepared, he realized that he had underestimated it when he smelled it. However, when he saw Harrison and Carla sitting in their seats with a blissful expression on their faces, and Carla had already picked up a piece of stinky tofu with her chopsticks and put it in her mouth with a blissful expression on her face, Abraham couldn't move his feet anymore. The stubbornness of a foodie made him stop in his tracks. He then calmed down and looked at the stinky tofu in front of him. The ink-black stinky tofu was neatly arranged on a long plate. The middle of the plate was filled with condiments, with bits of coriander and sticky brown sauce. It looked very tempting. The stench seemed to have softened a little at this moment. It was no longer pungent. Abraham seemed to have found a trace of fragrance in the thick stench, and it was slowly becoming clearer. It's so smelly that it's naturally fragrant. A look of astonishment appeared in Abraham's eyes. He sat down again and looked at the two people who were eating happily. He hesitated for a moment, then picked up his chopsticks, picked up a piece of stinky tofu, and put it into his mouth. After that, he chewed with all his might. Ha! 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 Abraham's eyes widened. The crispy and fragrant skin was bitten open, and the boiling hot soup that was wrapped in the stinky tofu instantly burst in his mouth. It was as if a pot of hot soup had spilled in his mouth. At that moment, there was only one word in his mind: hot. However, the scalding sensation only lasted for an instant. The spicy soup began to blossom with its unparalleled deliciousness. The thought of spitting it out only appeared in Abraham's mind for an instant. He opened his mouth wide and breathed heavily. The temperature gradually dropped, and the deliciousness began to appear. The fragrant and crispy skin looked as if it had been fried, but the inside was only slightly harder than the tofu pudding. It was so fresh and refreshing, and the spices that were wrapped in it gave it a rich flavor and texture. The stench had completely disappeared, and only the rich aroma was surging from all directions. He now understood that it wasn't the extreme stench that made it fragrant, but the extreme aroma that made it stinky. Only those who had tasted it could peel off the layer of stench and experience the extreme aroma. The extreme reversal of the stench and the aroma, the perfect combination of crispness and tenderness, left an indelible taste in his mouth. To be able to eat such delicious food, I have no regrets in life. After swallowing a mouthful of stinky tofu, Abraham's throat moved, and he murmured to himself with a satisfied expression. The surrounding customers also unconsciously swallowed their saliva. For a moment, they couldn't figure out how the person who had just jumped up from the stench could enjoy the food so much in the blink of an eye, and even let out such an exaggerated sigh of having no regrets in life. The one who was most astonished was Christy. After all, she had smelled that intense stench with her very own eyes. She couldn't even stand there for a second longer, let alone eat it. She didn't think that someone of Abraham's status would be able to enjoy his meal so much. Chapter 887. Uncle, you don't have to look at it. It's mine. I ordered it a long time ago. Carla flashed a bright smile at Abraham and reached out for Chris's stinky tofu. Hold on. Abraham also pressed down on the plate in an urgent manner. Hey, Uncle, I know you're older than me, but you can't take advantage of your seniority. Let go of me, or I'll scream. Mamie Restaurant has its rules. Carla looked at Abraham with an unfriendly expression and began to exert more force on his hand. Carla, Chris looked at the scene and couldn't help but feel anxious. Abraham's status was so high that it would be bad if Carla pissed him off. But seeing Carla's determined look, Carla didn't know how to persuade her. Hearing Carla's words, Abraham felt a little guilty. Before the dishes were served, he had carefully studied the rules written on the back of the menu. He knew better than anyone how stubborn Meg was. After all, he was the second person who dared to refuse the king's invitation and reward. The first one was Alex, who had resolutely refused the title of Northwest General that the king had given him. He had taken his sword and traveled the continent, leaving only a nominal position. Therefore, he followed the rules written on the menu. He was afraid that his name would be blacklisted by Meg. That would be a great loss for him. Robbing other people's food was worse than anything written on the menu. Abraham was all smiles as he said, little girl, don't be in such a hurry. How could I snatch your vegetables in broad daylight? I just have something to discuss with you. I'm not snatching. However, he had no intention of loosening his grip at all. You want to buy it? Carla frowned and shook her head. I won't sell it even if you pay 10 times the price. Abraham turned his gaze to Chris and said with a smile, I don't want to buy it from you. I want to make a deal with this young lady. Is this stinky tofu hers? So the decision is in her hands, right? Little girl, don't worry. Let's see what your friend says first. Mimi? Chris was surprised that Duke Abraham would talk to Carla so calmly over a bowl of stinky tofu. She didn't expect that Duke Abraham would leave the decision in her hands. Yes. Abraham nodded and glanced at the badge on Chris's chest. He smiled and said, I think you're an employee of Buffett Banks, right? I have a large sum of money in Rodu, and it has been piling up in the storeroom since 20 or 30 years ago. I should have quite a lot of money by now. If you agree to give this stinky tofu to me, I will deposit the money in Buffett Banks, and you will be the beneficiary. Chris's mouth was slightly agape as she looked at Abraham in disbelief. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. In the Buffett Bank system, there had always been a list of the most worthy people in the world. Apart from the dragons who used gold and silver as their mattresses, it was impossible for them to deposit money in the Buffett Bank system. Duke Abraham was ranked 10th on the list. There were 10 dukes in the Roth Empire. Except for Abraham, all of them had vast lands and endless wealth. Abraham didn't have any land, but he had an unknown amount of wealth. Apart from the huge inheritance left to him by the late king, he hadn't received any land in the past few years. Instead, he had received countless rewards from the king, as well as a series of properties under his name. No one knew how much money he had, but everyone knew he had a lot of money, the kind that was piled up in the storeroom. Countless marketing bigwigs from Buffett Banks had gone to Rodu to see Abraham, but he was either eating delicious food or on his way to eat delicious food. None of them had succeeded in pulling his money into the bank. But now, for a bowl of stinky tofu, Abraham had agreed to deposit his money in Buffett Banks, and he had even promised to put her name as the beneficiary. Even someone like Chris, who had done a lot of big deals, still felt a little dazed when she was suddenly hit by such a big piece of cake. Are you serious? She asked hesitantly. Carla looked at Chris in surprise. She had known Chris for more than a year, and this was the first time she had seen her lose her composure like this. And as the manager of a branch of Buffett Banks in Chaos City, she hadn't changed her expression at all when she first met her father. Who is he? Carla looked at Abraham again. Someone who could make Chris lose her composure must be richer than her father, and a lot richer. Yes, I'm a man of my word. I only want this stinky tofu. Abraham nodded, looking at the stinky tofu in their hands. Not only would this promise allow Chris to exceed this year's target, but she would also be able to get another promotion as she had just been promoted to a branch manager. However, Chris glanced at Carla and then looked at Abraham with regret. I've already promised to give this stinky tofu to Carla. I'm sorry, sir. If you can accept half of the stinky tofu and keep your promise, I can reluctantly give you half of the stinky tofu, Carla said, smiling at Abraham. Half. A hint of hesitation appeared on Abraham's face. Carla shrugged. If you don't make a decision now, the stinky tofu will get cold, and you won't be able to enjoy the taste of the juicy liquid. Deal. Abraham nodded without hesitation. Chris was pleasantly surprised. She looked at Carla gratefully. Carla winked at her, and her heart warmed. Carla and Abraham began to move the stinky tofu to their plates from both sides until there was only one piece left. They looked at each other, and the atmosphere was a little tense. Sir, I'm a little girl. Why don't you give me the stinky tofu since I'm so cute? Carla pouted. I'm cute too. Why don't you give me the stinky tofu? Abraham blinked his eyes like crazy. Carla was speechless. They are indeed evenly matched. Carla sighed in her heart. Looks like there's nothing more to say. Let's split it 50-50. Carla put away her expression and looked at Abraham coldly. Okay, I'll do it. Abraham asked for a steak knife from Yabamiya and began to cut the stinky tofu with a serious expression. Carla also came forward and looked at it with a serious face, afraid that she would eat too little. The steak knife cut into the stinky tofu, and the juices slowly flowed out. Chapter 888. The division of the stinky tofu had attracted a lot of attention. The way the two of them discussed the ownership of a piece of coriander had refreshed many people's understanding of the situation. However, the two of them didn't take it for granted. For a foodie, even a piece of coriander wouldn't be a problem. Chris's understanding of the situation had indeed been shaken, but her patience was as good as her mood. Now that she had Abraham's promise, she didn't have to worry about whether or not she could persuade the notorious businessman. All she needed to do was to get Abraham's written promise. Also, this case would definitely become a classic in the history of Buffett banks. A huge deposit receipt from a portion of stinky tofu. After finishing half of the stinky tofu, Abraham still wanted more, but he looked at the kitchen and got up to pay the bill. He also paid the bill for Chris and Carla. Thank you for your hospitality, Duke Abraham. My name is Christy. Christy bowed respectfully to Abraham as they exited the dining hall. Duke Abraham? Carla's expression changed. She swallowed her saliva and hurriedly bowed to Abraham. She stuck out her tongue and said, I didn't know you were a duke. I hope you don't blame me for offending you. Hi, little girl. I admire your attitude towards food. How could I blame you for it? Abraham waved his hand dismissively, then looked at Chris and said with a smile, Miss Chris should have recognized me long ago, right? Christy nodded and said yes. In Chaos City, the only person who can wear Faras' emerald ring is you, Duke Felipe. Chris, you're amazing. You can guess who he is with just a ring. Carla looked at Chris with admiration. Abraham nodded. He looked at Chris. I'm in Chaos City, but my money is in Rodu. I need someone to send a letter back. How much do you want me to deposit? Christy opened her mouth. This was the first time she had encountered a situation like this. No one knew how much money Duke Abraham had, but for a bank, the more the better. However, she didn't know how much she should say. All right, I roughly understand. I'll get them to open a money vault. Abraham nodded and waved to the servant waiting at the door. He asked the servant to take out a pen and paper and scribbled a line of words on it. Finally, he put the pen down and wrote his name on it before handing it to Chris. Thank you, Duke Abraham. Chris took the piece of paper with both hands and said in a somewhat emotional voice, You're welcome. If you come to Mamie's often, we might even become friends, Abraham said with a smile as he walked towards the carriage. How much money is in a vault? Carla asked curiously as she looked at the paper in Chris's hand. I don't know either, but it should be a lot of money. Chris blew at the ink on the paper. After making sure it was dry, she carefully put it away. Then she opened her arms and hugged Carla happily. Thank you, Carla. You don't have to be so polite with me. Carla pursed her lips and then smiled. But since you've accepted such a big order, You don't have to meet that legendary pervert tonight, right? I heard from my father that he's not a good person. No, I still have to attend the banquet tonight. It's my job. But with Duke Abraham's promise, I don't have to worry about anything. I won't let that pervert take advantage of me, Chris said with a smile. All right. You won't let those stinky men take advantage of you anyway. Carla nodded and said with some regret, I wanted to take you to see Suede's clothes. I heard that new clothes were released today. I was so angry that I didn't get that dress last time. Their clothes are so beautiful and super special. I have never seen them in a style that I have never seen before. Suede? I seem to have heard a lot about this shop from the rich ladies recently. Is it famous? I heard that a dress sold for 100,000 copper coins. The fight between Abraham and Carla over the stinky tofu made many customers who weren't interested in stinky tofu want to try it. It caused a small wave of orders. 100 stinky tofu were sold out quickly. Naturally, some customers who had tried it yesterday complained. Meg didn't hear their complaints. The restaurant's capacity determined the supply. Seeing the customers go from dislike to love, Meg felt a sense of accomplishment. Of course, he also felt a sense of satisfaction. Near the kitchen sat 4 big men in soft armor. They had long swords hanging from their waists and large glasses of beer in their hands. They were talking in a low voice. Have you heard? A few mercenary groups disappeared while on a mission recently. Their bodies were found later. It said that they weren't attacked by monsters. They were killed. Why haven't I heard? The news has been spreading like wildfire. It's the first time that so many mercenary groups have been wiped out. Many weak mercenary groups don't dare to go on missions anymore. Furthermore, I've also heard that these mercenary groups all have a unique characteristic, which is that there is at least one elf among their members. Mag, who was stir-frying, suddenly slowed down as he listened intently. Sure, it's not confirmed yet. Be careful not to be targeted by the Grey Temple for spreading rumors. Everyone's voices became much quieter. Do you think the City Lord's castle and the Grey Temple didn't do anything about it? Of course. They just haven't announced it yet. The Grey Temple and the City Lord's castle are more concerned than anyone else. It's just that it's not easy to catch the culprit in a short time. Mag's brows furrowed as he listened to everyone's conversation. It appeared that those bastards had most likely already extended their reach into Chaos City, and not only were they targeting the elves who were seeking refuge in Chaos City, they were also targeting the elves who were out on missions. The mercenaries didn't talk about this for long. Soon, they moved on to other things. Meg put the fried rice in the pot on a plate and handed it to Mia. These guys really deserve to die. Looks like I'll have to go hunting tomorrow. Chapter 889. Although the Marquis family wasn't as powerful as the Buffett family and the family Moreton, they were still one of the founding families of the Aden Chamber of Commerce, and one of their daughters had married Earl Boris of the Roth Empire as a concubine, so they still enjoyed a high status in Chaos City. Today's banquet was being held at the Marquis Manor, and the guests were all well-known figures in Chaos City's business world. They were either rich or respectable. Furthermore, it was said that a mysterious VIP would be attending, which also piqued many people's curiosity. Someone who could be treated as a VIP by the Marquis family must be of high status. At such a banquet, there were naturally many beauties. Apart from their families, there were also many beauties who came with all kinds of motives. They were all holding wine glasses and looking for their targets with smiles. Didn't you say that Miss Christie from Buffett Banks was coming to see me today? Where is she? A fat middle-aged man was sitting, scanning the crowd with an unhappy expression as he spoke to a servant beside him. That servant respectfully said, "Master, she made an appointment with you 3 days ago. I asked her to come to see you at the banquet as you instructed. If she wanted to get some money from you, she should have gotten it by now." Bart sneered. "Ha bitch, she even dares to stand me up. If she comes today, I'll definitely teach her a lesson. If she dares not to come, I'll see where else she can get money from today onwards." Christy, who was wearing an aqua blue dress, had actually arrived a long time ago. She was standing in the shadows with a glass of white wine in her hand, carefully sizing up Bart's back. Bart Kelt was the boss of the largest horse caravan in Chaos City. Apart from the major families who had their own horse caravans and some individual businessmen who did their own transportation, nearly one-third of Chaos City's goods were transported by his horse caravan. Just this alone was enough to make him one of the top nobles in Chaos City. However, Bart had only made his fortune in the past 20 to 30 years. Compared to the other major families, he was still lacking. Compared to the giants like the family Morton and the Buffett family, there was still a big gap between them. However, the horse caravan was a business that required payment in advance. There was basically no loss in business, so Bart had a huge amount of cash in his hands. This was something that others couldn't compare to. Buffett Banks was naturally the most sensitive to this. However, in the internal documents of Buffett Banks, as a local tycoon in Chaos City who had a huge amount of cash, Bart's recommendation index was at the bottom. His rating was not recommended for female salespeople to be alone. The reason was very simple. Bart was a complete pervert and pervert. He used his huge savings as bait and had already made a move on the staff of Buffett Bank several times. After that, he used various excuses to not fulfill his previous promises. He was basically blacklisted. Chris was naturally aware of this. If it wasn't for the fact that it was almost the end of the month and their branch still hadn't reached the $30 million deposit target, she wouldn't have targeted him. She had encountered this kind of guy before, but she had cleverly resolved it several times. She wasn't like those girls who foolishly threw away their chastity and failed to get what they wanted in the end. But now that she had Duke Abraham's letter of deposit, even though it wasn't his entire fortune, it should be no less than 30 million copper coins. Now that she had a better idea, she had more room to maneuver when dealing with a wily old fox like Bart. Compared to the target, she cared more about herself. She had always hated this kind of guy who used both hard and soft tactics to get the girls in charge of soliciting money. Bart looked at those rich businessmen who had gathered together and were talking and laughing. He finished the wine in his glass in one gulp. These old things had their eyes on their foreheads. They looked down on him, the boss of the horse caravan. Although they didn't say it out loud, they were always bad-mouthing him behind his back. His horse caravan had been growing bigger and bigger in recent years. The negotiations to buy the second-largest horse caravan in Chaos City were almost completed. As long as he bought that horse caravan, he would have control of 50% of Chaos City's logistics. It wouldn't be long before even Ian and Jeffrey would have to look at him on the same level. And those guys, when the time comes, they should be surrounding me and trying to please me, right? Bart laughed mockingly. As for why he came here today, other than wanting to trick the little beauty he saw before into his bed, the more important reason was to meet the mysterious VIP. He had heard some news. Although it hadn't been confirmed yet, it was enough for him to make a special trip here. Christy observed from the side for a long while. She handed the wine glass to a waiter, tidied her dress, took a deep breath, and walked over to Bart. Christy walked over to Bart with a polite smile and said, "Mr. Bart, I'm Christy from Buffett Banks. Nice to meet you." Bart held his wine glass and raised his eyes to look at Chris. His eyes lit up slightly, revealing a trace of desire. The beautiful Chris was wearing an aqua blue off-shoulder dress, revealing her delicate collarbone and a faintly discernible cleavage. Her light blonde, slightly wavy hair was draped over her shoulders, and the pair of white, slender legs that were exposed under her dress made him unable to shift his gaze away. Gorgeous little beauty. The corners of Bart's mouth curled up slightly, but his face suddenly became a little gloomy. He sneered at Christy and said, "You said you wanted to see me, but made me wait here for so long. Do you know how precious my time is?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Bart. I was delayed by work, and there are still 10 minutes to the time we agreed on. I didn't expect you to come so early." Christy still had a professional smile on her face. She didn't show any self-blame or fear at all. "The time we agreed on?" Bart laughed disdainfully. He looked at Christy and said, "When I arrive is the time we agreed on. Shouldn't you be waiting here in advance? Besides, is there anything more important than me?" A hint of disgust flashed across Christy's eyes, but she didn't show it on her face. Bart was indeed more annoying than the rumors said. "You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.